Hi friend, come on in and get settled. Pull that blanket up a little higher tonight because I think this one is going to be worth staying up a few extra minutes for. I've been wanting to tell you this story for a while now, and tonight finally feels like the right night for it. Picture a king, young, powerful, surrounded by advisors who controlled almost every decision in his life. Now picture him slipping out before sunrise, sneaking past the very men who ran his kingdom, just to marry a woman none of them would have ever approved of. And here's the strange part. He kept that secret for 4 whole months, even from the one man who had helped put him on the throne in the first place. Before we step into this together, if these quiet little stories have somehow become part of your bedtime routine, it would mean a lot to me if you tapped that subscribe button, left a like, or dropped a comment down below. I look through every single one, and honestly, they feel like little notes from friends I've never actually met. So tell me, where are you tonight, and what time is it where you are? I'd love to know. Now go ahead. Dim the lights just a little, maybe turn on a fan or something soft in the background, get as comfortable as your body will let you. Because we're about to step into a spring morning that quietly reshaped an entire kingdom. We're heading back to England in the middle of the 1400s, a country still bruised from a long tangled family war for the crown, the one history books now call the Wars of the Roses. 2 branches of the same royal family, each certain the throne belonged to them, spent years pulling England apart at the seams. By the time our story begins, one side had won, at least for the moment, and a very young man was sitting on the throne because of it. But this isn't really a story about battles. It's about what happened quietly on an ordinary back road once the fighting had already moved somewhere else. The young man who now wore the crown had come to it the hard way. His own father had died in that war, cut down in battle, and Edward had fought his way to the throne himself, barely out of his teenage years, in a battle so brutal that the snow on the ground that day was said to have turned red for miles. He'd been crowned soon after, still something of a stranger to half his own court, expected to rule like a seasoned monarch, while barely old enough to grow a proper beard. Long before anyone called her a queen, Elizabeth Woodville was simply a widow with 2 small sons and very little left to lose. Chroniclers who saw her described pale golden hair and a calm, steady kind of beauty, the sort that made people stop mid-sentence. But beauty didn't pay debts, and it certainly didn't return stolen land. Her first husband, a knight named John Grey, had died fighting on the losing side of that same war, leaving her with 2 little boys, Thomas and Richard, and a household slowly running out of money. Because he had fought for the losing side, the new king's court disputed her sons' claim to their father's land. Her income was gone. Her son's inheritance sat tangled in legal limbo, buried under paperwork nobody seemed in a hurry to sign. What she had left was a modest manor house, a mother with a few useful connections at court and a stubborn kind of courage. Her mother, by the way, was no stranger to scandal herself. Years earlier, Jacquetta of Luxembourg had been a duchess, married into one of the grandest families in Europe, until she fell for a household knight far beneath her station, and married him in secret against everyone's wishes. It caused a small uproar at the time. It's worth remembering that detail because apparently in this family, falling for the wrong person and marrying them anyway ran a little in the blood. So when word reached her that the young king would be riding near her family's home in Northamptonshire, Elizabeth Woodville did something bold. She took her 2 boys by the hand, walked out to the road that cut through Whittlebury Forest, and waited, beneath an old oak tree, for a king she had never met. It was by later description a soft morning, the kind where the forest still holds on to the night's chill. Her boys stood close against her skirts, too young to fully understand what their mother was risking, only old enough to know that grand men on horses were something worth being a little afraid of. Edward IV, by nearly every account that survives from the period, was hard to miss. He stood well over 6 feet tall, in an age when most men never came close. He was warm, easy to talk to. Only in his early 20s himself, already hardened by 2 brutal battles, and thoroughly used to getting whatever he wanted. So when his hunting party rounded a bend in the road and found a woman kneeling with 2 frightened boys beside her, the king slowed his horse. Elizabeth asked for something simple on the surface at least. The return of her son's inheritance, the land that should have belonged to them. On paper it was a plain legal request. In practice it was anything but plain. Because by the time she rose from her knees, the King of England could not stop thinking about her. Now I'll be honest with you here the way I try to be every night. The chroniclers who first wrote this scene down did so decades later, and they clearly loved it a little too much. Some of the smaller details, the exact tree, the exact words spoken, may have grown in the retelling the way stories tend to do at court, passed from mouth to mouth for years. But the heart of it holds up under closer study. A widow asked a king for simple justice. And somewhere in that plain conversation on a quiet stretch of road, something else began. What followed was not a public romance. It couldn't be. Edward was at that moment one of the most sought-after men in Europe, and his own advisers were deep into negotiations to marry him off to a French princess, a match meant to seal peace between 2 countries that had been at war for longer than most people could remember. There were even whispers of other noble matches on the table, each one weighed for the alliance it might bring, never for the person attached to it. A king did not simply choose his own wife, not officially, not according to anyone standing around him. But Edward, as it turns out, had other plans entirely. He began riding out to Grafton in secret without the usual noise of a royal procession. No trumpets, no banners. Just a small group of riders moving down country lanes at odd hours, looking like nothing more than travellers with somewhere unremarkable to be. Try for a moment to picture the most powerful man in England, a man who commanded armies, suddenly developing a deep and passionate interest in hunting. Again, in the exact same patch of forest. Week after week at strangely convenient hours in weather that really shouldn't have made anyone want to be outdoors chasing deer. His own men must have started to wonder if the deer in Northamptonshire were simply that fascinating. Word of these visits couldn't be allowed to spread beyond the household. Servants were trusted, just enough letters were kept short, and Elizabeth learned quickly to keep her expression perfectly ordinary whenever anyone at court so much as mentioned the king's name. One careless word from the wrong person, and the whole arrangement could collapse before it ever had the chance to become real. By the spring of 1464 the king had made up his mind. On the morning of the 1st of May, before most of the household at Grafton had even woken up, a small group gathered inside the Woodville family home, careful to keep their voices low, careful not to let a single servant guess what the morning held. There was no grand hall, no choir, no crowd of noblemen in their finest clothing, no feast waiting outside the door, just a priest. Elizabeth's mother Jaquetta standing quietly nearby, 2 gentlewomen to help with the small details, and a young man brought along to help with the singing, because even a secret wedding apparently still needed a little music. Sunlight would have been just starting to reach through the windows. The house would have still smelled of the night before. Someone would have swept the floor the evening before, just in case, without ever daring to ask why. The priest kept his voice low enough that even the walls seemed to be listening. And in that plain little room, with almost nobody watching the vows, took barely more time than it takes to boil water for tea. And then it was done. The King of England had just married a woman with no royal blood, no foreign alliance, and no political value whatsoever, in front of 5 witnesses and an early morning stillness. Elizabeth walked out of that small room as the secret wife of a king, and she couldn't tell a single soul outside those walls. Not her closest friends, not a single member of the royal court, not even the household staff who would notice sooner or later that something about her had changed. For 4 months she returned to something close to her old life. raising her boys, running her modest household, sitting through ordinary conversations about ordinary things, all while carrying a secret large enough to reshape an entire kingdom. And Edward did something almost stranger. He rode back to his court and simply carried on as if nothing had changed. He sat through council meetings about his upcoming French marriage, nodding along as men debated which foreign princess would suit him best. He let his most trusted adviser, a nobleman named Richard Neville, keep negotiating that very match on his behalf overseas, with absolutely no idea that the groom already had a wife waiting for him back home. There's something almost funny about it if you let yourself picture it clearly. A king nodding along in serious council meetings about who he ought to marry, while his actual wife sat in the countryside, likely wondering when, or if he'd ever find the nerve to tell anyone the truth. Somewhere between duty and desire, the King of England had simply chosen not to choose, at least not yet, hoping the whole situation might quietly sort itself out on its own. But underneath the humour sits something a great deal heavier, because for Elizabeth this was never simply a fairy tale beginning. It was 4 months of living 2 separate lives at once. 4 months of loving a man she couldn't publicly claim as her own. 4 months of watching him ride away after every quiet visit, never quite sure when or if he would come back. 4 months of knowing that the moment this secret finally came out, she would either become one of the most powerful women in England, or lose everything all over again this time with no way of asking for it back. That is the quiet, exhausting math of loving someone in secret, weighing what you might gain against everything you stand to lose every single day, with nobody to share the weight of that decision but yourself. That secret didn't stay buried forever. When it finally surfaced months later right in front of the very advisers Edward had been quietly deceiving, it did more than embarrass a king. It cracked open a rivalry that would shape the rest of his reign, and cost more than one person their comfortable place at court. We'll come back to that particular morning later, because it deserves its own space to breathe. But for tonight, here's the part of Edward and Elizabeth's story worth sitting with for a moment before we go any further. They got to choose each other. Almost nobody else in their world had that privilege. For most people living through the Middle Ages, marriage was rarely something that happened between 2 hearts that quietly found each other beneath an oak tree in front of nobody but a handful of trusted witnesses. It was something decided at a table by parents over documents and money and family pride, sometimes long before either person involved was even old enough to understand what was being signed away on their behalf. No secret rides through the forest, no stolen mornings, just negotiations conducted calmly over a future 2 young people rarely had much say in at all. For the vast majority of women in this period there was no oak tree moment, no forest road, no king slowing his horse out of pure curiosity. There was only a decision made for them quietly by people who loved them, or at least believed they knew best. And that is exactly where we're headed next. Let's pull up a seat at that very table for a moment, because once you see what actually happened there, you start to understand exactly how unusual Edward's little rebellion truly was. For most families with anything worth protecting land, a trade and name people recognized around the market square, marriage wasn't a single moment. It was a project. Sometimes a years-long one with more paperwork than romance. Think of it less like a wedding and more like a merger between 2 small businesses, except the merchandise under discussion happened to be somebody's daughter, and the shareholders happened to be her own parents. I know that sounds harsh. Stay with me though, because the truth of it is stranger and honestly a little sadder than most people expect. In a household with any property at all, a daughter was in the coldest possible sense an asset. Her marriage could bring in land. It could settle old debts. It could tie one family's fortune to another's the way a modern business deal might join 2 companies under a shared name. Parents weren't necessarily cruel for thinking this way. Most of them loved their children a great deal, but love and financial survival were rarely allowed to occupy the same sentence back then. If you want a slightly ridiculous modern comparison, imagine your parents keeping a private spreadsheet on you, tracking not your hobbies or your personality, but your land value, your family connections, and how many acres you might realistically bring into a marriage. Nobody wrote it down quite that plainly, of course. But that was more or less the quiet math running underneath most of these conversations. So how did these matches actually get made? Usually it started with letters. Discreet ones often carried by a trusted servant or a family friend feeling out whether a particular household might be open to discussing a match between their son and someone else's daughter. Sometimes an older relative or a well-connected neighbour acted as a go-between, quietly gathering information, the way a modern matchmaking service might, except instead of asking about hobbies and favourite films, they were asking about acreage, annual income, and whether the family had any embarrassing debts hiding in the background. Among wealthier merchant families in the towns, this process could get remarkably organised. Certain well-placed neighbours, lawyers, or even parish clergy built quiet reputations as people who knew which households had a marriageable daughter, which had a son in need of a wife, and roughly what each side could bring to the table. There was no formal office for this, no signed contract for their services, but the role was real enough, and being on good terms with the right go-between could speed a negotiation along considerably. Reputation travelled fast in these circles. A family known for honest dealing, or one quietly rumoured to be drowning in debt, would find their marriage prospects shifting almost overnight, long before either side ever exchanged a single letter directly. Once both sides showed real interest, the negotiations turned serious and often dragged on for months. We'll get properly into the money side of all this a little later, because it deserves its own space. For now, just know that behind almost every conversation about a possible marriage sat a much less romantic conversation about land coin and future inheritance. And here's the detail that tends to surprise people the most. Through most of this process, the two people who were actually going to be married had very little say in any of it. Now, I want to pause here and ask you something. If your own marriage or the choice of who to spend your life with had been decided at a table by your parents, based mostly on money, would you have gone along quietly, or would you have been the one causing trouble? Because at least one young woman in England did exactly that. And thanks to an extraordinary stroke of luck, we still have her story in her own family's handwriting. Her name was Marjorie Paston, and she belonged to a family that, without meaning to, left behind one of the richest personal archives to survive from this entire period. The Pastons were landed gentry from Norfolk, sharp, ambitious, endlessly litigious, and absolutely obsessed with letter writing. Over several generations they wrote to each other constantly about lawsuits about crops, about which neighbour was threatening to seize which manor this month, and again about marriage. Hundreds of these letters survive today, and through them historians can actually watch a real medieval family run their own private marriage market in something close to real time. By the time our story picks up, Marjorie had already been on that market for years. Her parents had been quietly shopping for a suitable husband for her since she was around 14 years old. Several negotiations had already come and gone, each one falling apart over money or status or simply bad timing. She was closing in on 20, which for a young woman of her class was starting to feel uncomfortably late, and somewhere in the middle of all that waiting she fell for entirely the wrong person. His name was Richard Carley, and he wasn't a lord or a merchant's heir or anyone remotely suitable on paper. He was the family's bailiff, the man who managed the Paston estates, collected rents from tenants, kept the accounts, and quietly ran half the family's business for them. He was clever. He was reliable. Several Paston sons trusted him completely with their finances and their legal disputes, but his own family sold candles and mustard out of a shop in a small Suffolk town, and to the Pastons, a family working very hard to be seen as proper gentry, that background made him almost laughably unsuitable as a son-in-law. When Marjorie's brother heard the rumours, he wrote home in something close to horror, insisting he would never give his blessing to see his own sister reduced, in his words, to selling candles and mustard alongside a shopkeeper's son. Marjorie's mother, Margaret, was even angrier. She'd suspected something was going on for years, warning her eldest son to keep an eye on Calais long before the situation came fully into the open. And there may have been another reason for her fury, one that never gets written down directly in the letters. Marjorie had grown up hearing about a relative of her own, who'd been forced into a marriage she despised through methods far crueler than a stern conversation at the dinner table. It's not hard to imagine that memory sitting somewhere in the back of Marjorie's mind as she made her own choice. Because here's the twist almost nobody expects. Marjorie didn't run away. She didn't need to. Under the rules the church itself had laid out, a couple could become legally permanently married simply by exchanging the right words in the present tense, meaning them sincerely even with no priest present and no family blessing whatsoever. It sounds almost too simple to be real, and yet it was completely true. If two people said in effect, "I take you as my husband and I take you as my wife," and meant it, the marriage existed the moment those words left their mouths. The wedding, the priest, the banns, all of that could technically come later. The vow itself was the marriage, so Marjorie and Richard did exactly that. Quietly, without witnesses beyond each other, they made their promises to one another, and as far as the law of the church was concerned, they were now husband and wife, whether her family liked it or not. When Margaret Paston found out, she did not take it well. Letters between Richard and Marjorie were intercepted and destroyed. Marjorie was kept under close watch, effectively confined, while her mother arranged to have her sent away to another household in London, somewhere she might, in her mother's hopeful phrasing, come to her senses. Richard was dismissed from his position and told in no uncertain terms that he would never be welcomed back. But a private vow was not something a furious mother could simply erase with the stern letter. So the family did what any respectable household with a legal problem did in this period. They took it to the church. The case went before the Bishop of Norwich, one of the most powerful churchmen in the region, in the hope that he would declare the whole thing invalid and free Marjorie to marry someone more suitable. What followed must have been one of the more tense afternoons of Marjorie's short life. Picture the room itself for a moment, a formal chamber inside the bishop's own residence. Cold stone official documents laid out on the table, a room built specifically to make ordinary people feel small in front of church authority. According to her own brother's account, the bishop didn't simply ask her a few polite questions. He reminded her quite pointedly exactly who she was, what family she came from, and everything she stood to lose if she refused to cooperate. He painted a clear picture of the shame, the rejection, and the loss of comfort that would follow if she continued to defy her parents. Marjorie held her ground anyway. Pressed to repeat the exact words she had spoken to Richard, she did without flinching, and added something to the effect that whatever those words had technically been, she believed in her own conscience that she was already bound to him and always would be. That single answer settled the matter. The bishop, weighing her testimony against her family's wishes, ruled that the marriage was valid. Canon law in the end cared far more about sincere intention than about parental approval. Marjorie had won her case and lost her family in almost the same breath. Her mother refused to let her back into the house. For a time she had nowhere to stay until the bishop himself arranged lodging with a respectable family nearby. Try to picture that for a moment. A young woman barely out of her teenage years standing in a stranger's borrowed home, cut off from the only household she'd ever known, with nothing but a legal ruling and a man she loved to show for it. Was it worth it? I honestly don't know how I'd answer that question in her place, and I'm not sure she always knew either. Eventually she and Richard were formally married by a priest banns and all, to settle the matter beyond any legal doubt, and they built a life together in Norwich. Richard, interestingly enough, was eventually allowed back into the family's employment. The Pastons, whatever their feelings, still needed a capable bailiff far more than they needed to hold a grudge against one. But he was never truly welcomed as family. He managed their money for years while remaining in every social sense an outsider at their table. Marjorie and Richard went on to have 3 sons together, and here's the part of this story that tends to sit heavily with people once they hear it. Marjorie didn't live particularly long afterward. She died young, likely still in her 20s, and the strained relationship with her mother never fully healed before she did. Whatever peace she found with Richard, she paid for it in family she never quite got back. I think about her often when people describe medieval marriage as though it only ever went one of 2 ways, either a loveless business deal or occasionally a fairy tale like the one we open tonight's story with. Marjorie's story sits in a much messier, much more human middle ground. She used the very same legal system her family relied on to control her, and turned it into the one tool sharp enough to set her free. It cost her almost everything she'd grown up with. She seems to have decided it was worth paying anyway. Not every young woman in a similar position made that same choice, and honestly, most couldn't have. A few years later, another young woman connected to this same family, also named Marjorie, fell for a Paston son under far gentler circumstances. Their parents negotiated for months over money and land, the usual slow business of it all, and once the numbers finally worked out for both sides, the couple married with everyone's blessing. What survives from their courtship isn't a bishop's tense interrogation. It's a tender little letter she sent him beforehand, one historians now consider among the earliest romantic valentines ever written in the English language. So the system wasn't purely cruel, and it wasn't purely kind either. It could crush a young woman under its weight, or if the numbers happened to line up in her favour, it could occasionally leave a little room for real affection to grow inside the deal. Further down the social ladder among ordinary labourers and tenant farmers, this whole business looked noticeably different. There was rarely a manor or a title riding on the outcome, so families tended to loosen their grip considerably. Many young peasants spent their teenage years working as servants in someone else's household, earning modest wages, learning a trade, and saving whatever small amount they could towards setting up a home of their own one day. That practice, sometimes called life cycle service, quietly reshaped the whole timeline of ordinary marriage. Instead of being paired off as teenagers by their parents, most peasant men and women didn't marry until their mid-20s, once they'd actually saved enough to survive as an independent household. And because there was comparatively little land or family reputation at stake, they generally had far more freedom to choose that partner for themselves. A young couple meeting at market or working the same fields, or living under the same roof as fellow servants stood a real chance of choosing each other honestly, without a single letter of negotiation ever needing to be written. It's worth sitting with that for a second. The families with the least to lose were often ironically the ones with the most freedom to marry for love. The families with the most to protect land titles, reputations built over generations, were the ones most likely to trade their children's happiness for financial security. Wealth, it turns out, bought plenty of things in the Middle Ages. Personal choice in marriage often wasn't one of them. For now, it's worth simply remembering this: the more property, land, and family reputation a household had riding on a marriage, the less say the bride and groom generally had in choosing each other. And property, land, and reputation always led back to the same uncomfortable question every family eventually had to sit down and answer. Not who their child should marry, how much exactly that marriage was going to cost them, and who in the end was expected to pay for it. Money, that's really where we left off, isn't it? Because underneath every negotiation, every letter passed quietly between 2 households, Every hopeful young couple waiting to hear whether their families had come to an agreement sat one blunt, unavoidable question. Who was paying for this marriage, and how much was it going to cost them? It's easy to imagine medieval money as something abstract coins in a chest numbers on a page nobody living today could ever really picture. But for the families involved, this was as real and as stressful as any modern conversation about mortgages, savings, or who covers the deposit on a first home. The stakes simply happened to include an entire household's future, and sometimes a good deal more than that. Let's actually break that down properly, because the honest answer is more layered than most people realize, and it involves two very different kinds of money that people tend to lump together without noticing. The first was the dowry. This was the money, land, or goods a bride's family handed over to the groom's household when she married. Think of it as her family's contribution to the new marriage, a kind of financial proof that she came with real value, attached not just good manners and a pleasant singing voice. Wealthier families sometimes handed over sums so large they could outstrip what the groom himself earned in a full year of work. Poorer families offered whatever they actually had: a cow, a few coins, a chest of linen, and household goods carefully saved for exactly this purpose. Here's the part that rarely makes it into the fairy tale version of any of this. A dowry wasn't always handed over in one tidy lump sum on the wedding day. Wealthier families often paid it in installments spread across several years, the way a modern family might structure a large payment plan. And if the money stopped arriving, if a father died before finishing the payments, or simply ran short of coin, the groom's family had every legal right to complain, delay the wedding, or in some cases walk away from the arrangement entirely. Marriage contracts from this period survived precisely because families took this seriously enough to write it all down and keep records the same way you'd keep paperwork for any other serious financial agreement. Love letters rarely survive from this world in any real number. Unpaid dowry disputes, on the other hand, left behind a small mountain of paperwork. The second was something almost nobody outside a history class ever hears about, and it worked in the opposite direction entirely. It was called the dower, and it was the groom's side of the bargain. Essentially, a husband was expected to set aside a portion of his own land, usually around 1/3 of everything he owned, to support his wife financially, if he died before she did. It wasn't a gift for the wedding day. It was insurance for widowhood, guaranteeing that a woman wouldn't simply be left destitute the moment her husband's heart stopped beating. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it quietly undercuts a lot of what people assume about this period. Yes, women were treated as assets in these negotiations far too often. And while a marriage lasted, a wife typically had little to no independent control over her own property at all, since the law generally folded her finances into her husband's. But the system also understood, at least on paper, that a widow deserved some kind of financial floor beneath her the moment that arrangement ended, rather than being tossed out the moment her usefulness as a wife technically expired. This protection didn't appear out of pure kindness either. It showed up because powerful men had grown thoroughly sick of watching kings and greedy relatives exploit vulnerable widows for profit, forcing them into fresh marriages, purely to control their land, or squeezing outrageous fees out of them before they could even collect what was legally theirs. Enough noblemen had watched this happen to their own mothers, sisters, and aunts that they finally decided to write a permanent stop to it into law. Picture what that dower actually meant for an ordinary widow's daily life for a moment. It wasn't pocket money. It was often the difference between keeping a roof over her children's heads or losing the household entirely to a distant relative circling for the inheritance. A widow with a properly assigned dower could run her own farm, pay her own debts, and raise her children without needing to remarry purely to survive. Without it, she had almost nothing standing between her and total dependence on whichever relative decided to take pity on her. And this wasn't some obscure footnote buried in a dusty legal manuscript somewhere. It made it into one of the most famous documents in English history. In the year 1215, when a group of furious barons forced King John to put his seal on the Great Charter, better known today as Magna Carta, two of its very first clauses dealt with exactly this issue. One guaranteed that a widow would receive her dower promptly without being forced to pay anyone for the privilege of collecting what was legally already hers. The next guaranteed something even more striking for the time. No widow could be forced into a second marriage against her wishes so long as she preferred to remain unmarried. On paper that sounds almost progressive. In practice there was a catch, and it's the kind of detail that tells you everything about how this world actually worked. A widow who wanted to remain unmarried still had to pay the crown for that right, essentially buying her own freedom from a forced second marriage. Records from King John's reign show roughly 150 wealthy widows paying exactly this kind of fee just to be left alone. So even a legal protection meant to shield women from being remarried off like property still came with a price tag attached, collected by the very king who was supposed to be protecting them. Would you have paid it if you were in their position? Freedom technically guaranteed, but only if you could afford the fee to actually use it. Now everything I've described so far involves fairly ordinary sums of land and money, the kind that could shape one family's future for a generation or two. But every so often in this period a marriage came along where the dowry wasn't measured in coins or acres at all. It was measured in an entire country. In the summer of 1137, a teenage girl became one of the wealthiest people in Europe almost overnight. Her name was Eleanor, and her father, the Duke of Aquitaine, had just died, leaving her his eldest surviving child as heir to one of the largest and richest territories in France. Aquitaine wasn't some minor patch of countryside. It stretched across much of the southwest of the continent, covering roughly a third of what we'd now call France, and by most measures it was wealthier and better governed than the comparatively modest lands directly controlled by the King of France himself. By every account that survives, Eleanor herself was unusually well prepared for the position fate had just dropped on her. She'd been raised in one of the most cultured courts in Europe, fluent, sharp, and educated well beyond what most noblewomen of her era were ever offered. None of that made her any less of a target. If anything, it made her more of one, because a young unmarried heiress sitting on that much wealth was to every ambitious family within sailing distance an emergency waiting to be solved. The King of France at the time understood exactly what that meant. Within months of her father's death, he arranged for his own son and heir, a young man also named Louis, to marry Eleanor as quickly as possible before any rival could get to her first. It worked. Eleanor became Queen of France almost as an afterthought to the far more urgent business of securing her inheritance for the crown. Here's where it gets interesting though, because a marriage arranged for land doesn't automatically become a happy one just because the paperwork went smoothly. Eleanor and Louis, now King Louis VII, had 2 daughters together but no sons, and in a world obsessed with securing a male heir, that absence started to weigh heavily on the marriage. Things weren't helped by a long, difficult journey the two of them took together on the Second Crusade, travelling all the way to the Holy Land alongside thousands of soldiers and pilgrims. It was meant to strengthen their partnership. Instead, tensions between them only sharpened once they arrived, worsened by gossip about Eleanor's closeness with a relative who ruled one of the Crusader territories. Gossip that may well have been exaggerated by people who simply found her too outspoken and independent for their comfort. Whatever the truth buried underneath all that court gossip, the relationship between husband and wife had grown cold and strained by the early 1150s. In the spring of 1152, the church granted them an annulment officially on the grounds that the couple were too closely related by blood, a technicality convenient enough to have been overlooked entirely 15 years earlier, back when marrying her seemed like an excellent idea. And here's the detail that tends to make people sit up a little straighter. Because Aquitaine had always legally belonged to Eleanor herself, not to her husband, the annulment didn't strip it away from her. She walked out of that marriage still one of the richest landholders in Europe, single independent, and as far as several ambitious noblemen were concerned, suddenly very much back on the market. One of them didn't even bother with letters or negotiations. According to accounts from the period, a nobleman named Geoffrey of Anjou attempted to simply kidnap her, outright planning to force a marriage on her before anyone else could react and claim her fortune first. Think about that for a moment. A woman who ruled a third of France, who had already been Queen of France for 15 years, was still the very instant she became single, again, treated by at least one ambitious young nobleman as something you could simply grab off the road and marry by force. Eleanor fortunately saw it coming and escaped before he ever got the chance. Would you have trusted anyone after that? Or would you have started making your own arrangements immediately on your own terms before somebody else tried something similar? Because that's more or less exactly what Eleanor did. Rather than wait around for another arranged proposal to land in her lap, she reportedly sent word directly to Geoffrey's older brother, a young duke named Henry, essentially inviting him to come and marry her himself on her own timeline before anyone else could interfere. He didn't need to be asked twice. 8 weeks after her annulment was finalised, barely enough time for the ink to dry on the paperwork, Eleanor married Henry, in a small, hastily arranged ceremony, without much of the pomp their rank would normally have demanded. Some accounts suggest the wedding was kept deliberately quiet out of genuine fear that her former husband might try to stop it if word got out in time. He didn't manage to, and when he found out it must have landed like a gut punch. Because Henry wasn't just some minor nobleman. He already controlled Normandy, Anjou, Maine and Touraine, a substantial stretch of territory in its own right. The moment he married Eleanor, all of Aquitaine's wealth and land joined his existing holdings in a single afternoon, creating a combined territory that dwarfed what the King of France himself directly controlled. 2 years later, Henry became King of England as well, meaning one household now personally ruled over more French soil than the actual King of France did. I don't think it's an exaggeration to call this one of the more spectacular financial blunders in medieval history. Louis had quite literally let the single most valuable marriage portion in Europe walk out the door and remarry into the hands of his most dangerous rival, all because a marriage arranged for land had quietly failed to survive as a marriage for people. Historians would later group Henry's combined territories under a single name, the Angevin Empire, a sprawling patchwork of English and French lands controlled by one family, stretching from the cold hills of northern England down to the warm coastline of southern France. Somewhere one imagines a royal treasurer in Paris spent a very uncomfortable afternoon explaining to Louis exactly how much territory had just slipped through his fingers over what had at its core started out as a failed marriage. The rivalry that single decision created between the English and French crowns didn't fade quickly either. It simmered on for generations, feeding directly into centuries of conflict over exactly which side of the Channel these territories truly belonged to. All because decades earlier one very well-connected teenage heiress inherited the wrong stretch of land at exactly the right moment. I bring up Eleanor's story specifically because it puts everything else we've talked about tonight into sharper focus. Somewhere down at the bottom of medieval society, a peasant family might spend months negotiating over a single cow and a chest of linen, treating every last coin of it with the same seriousness a modern family might bring to a mortgage. Somewhere in the comfortable middle, a family like the ones we've already met might spend years working out land coin and reputation before finally letting a couple exchange vows. And somewhere near the very top, an entire generation of European politics could hinge on which household managed to secure one particularly valuable bride. Different scale, Wildly different sums of money involved, and yet exactly the same underlying logic running quietly beneath every single one of them. Marriage wasn't simply about who loved whom. It was about who could afford the deal, and who stood to lose the most if it ever fell apart. What strikes me most honestly is how little choice anyone at any level of this system actually had over their own financial fate. A peasant girl worried about her cow and her linen chest. A queen worried about an entire dukedom. Neither of them got to simply opt out of the conversation and marry for reasons that had nothing to do with money at all. The numbers were just bigger or smaller depending on where you happened to be born, and once families fully grasped just how much money and power could ride on a single well-placed marriage, an obvious and slightly uncomfortable idea followed close behind. Why wait until your children were old enough to have opinions about any of this when you could lock the whole arrangement in years earlier, long before they had any real say in the matter at all? That's exactly the uncomfortable corner of this story we're heading into next. 12. That's the number I want you to hold on to for the next few minutes, because it sits right at the centre of one of the more uncomfortable corners of this whole story. We've talked about who chose a marriage, and we've talked about what it cost. There's a third question sitting right underneath both of those, one that tends to make modern audiences flinch a little more than either money or family politics ever do. How young was too young? Under the rules the church laid out across most of medieval Europe, 12 was the legal age at which a girl could be considered old enough to marry. For a boy it was 14. Below that age, any promise of marriage a family arranged was technically only a betrothal, a formal pledge for the future, not an actual binding marriage yet. And this distinction mattered enormously, because it meant a family could lock in an alliance years, sometimes over a decade, before either child involved had any real say in the matter, all while staying at least on paper within the boundaries of what the law allowed. So naturally ambitious families used that gap for everything it was worth. Among the highest ranks of society, it wasn't unusual for a betrothal to be arranged, while a child was still in the cradle, sometimes within days of being born, long before anyone could guess what kind of person they'd eventually grow into. These early promises functioned less like a wedding and more like a diplomatic insurance policy, a way of quietly reserving a future alliance years in advance, with the actual marriage and any question of consummation pushed safely off towards some distant point in the future, once both children had grown old enough for it to matter. Plenty of these childhood betrothals quietly fell apart long before the wedding day ever arrived, broken off the moment political circumstances shifted with barely a ripple of scandal attached. Nobody expected an infant's promise to survive contact with changing fortunes. It was the marriages that actually went ahead as planned, especially the ones involving very young brides, that tended to leave the deepest mark on history. Nowhere is this stranger or more instructive than in the story of a 6-year-old French princess who found herself almost overnight Queen of England. Her name was Isabella, daughter of the King of France, and in the autumn of 1396 she was married to Richard II of England, a 29-year-old widower more than 3 times her age. This wasn't remotely about affection. It was about ending a war. England and France had been locked in on and off fighting for decades by this point, in the long conflict later generations would call the 100 Years' War, and both sides were exhausted enough to want a pause. Marrying off a child was quite literally the price of peace. The agreement they signed alongside the wedding secured a 28-year truce between the two crowns, one of the longest stretches of calm either country had seen in a generation. Somewhere in a French council chamber, grown men in expensive robes must have quietly congratulated themselves on a brilliant piece of diplomacy, apparently without pausing to consider that the instrument of peace they'd just negotiated was still small enough to be carried into her own wedding. Picture the scene at Calais for a moment. A little girl in a blue velvet gown sewn with golden lilies, a small crown balanced on her head, carried into the room by two grown men because she was too small and too overwhelmed to walk in herself. Reports from the time describe her in tears, through much of it clutching, according to some accounts, a favourite doll that had been packed among her wedding belongings. She was not yet 7 years old. Try for a moment to imagine being crowned queen of a foreign country before you'd lost all of your baby teeth. What would that even do to a person's sense of who they were? Now here's where the story becomes properly important rather than simply strange. The marriage treaty specifically stated that the union could not be consummated until Isabella reached the legal age of 12. Canon law was completely clear on that point, and both sides honoured it right down to the smallest detail of how the two of them were kept apart. Isabella lived in her own household at Windsor Castle, with her own French governess, her own ladies in waiting, her own small court entirely separate from the king's. Richard, by most surviving accounts, treated her with real warmth, more like a favourite niece than a wife visiting her regularly, where servants said she and her ladies truly looked forward to seeing him arrive. He was said to be funny in her company, playful even aside of a king that court chroniclers rarely bothered recording elsewhere. Whatever else this marriage was, and it was certainly a piece of cold political theatre dressed up in velvet and gold it was, in this particular case never anything else. Richard was overthrown a few years later and died in captivity, and Isabella, still a child, found herself a widowed queen in a country not her own, sent home to France still legally untouched. Her marriage annulled her dowry, left unpaid her enormous political value, quietly evaporating along with her husband's crown. She eventually married again years later to a cousin closer to her own age. She died in childbirth before turning 20, the very fate that canon law's 12-year threshold had been quietly designed, at least in theory, to protect young women from facing too soon. I bring up Isabella's story specifically because it complicates the picture in an important way. A great many royal child marriages, maybe even most of them, were exactly like hers, symbolic, patient, and never physically consummated, until both parties were considerably older, if the marriage even lasted that long. The legal age of 12 existed as a flaw, not a target. Most families, even ruthlessly ambitious ones, understood that waiting a few more years cost them nothing at all, and protected a truly vulnerable child in their care, while still locking in every political advantage the marriage was designed to secure. The peace it brought lasted for years. The girl at the centre of it was, by most measures we can verify, looked after with something close to real tenderness, in a situation that easily could have gone very differently. Not every family showed that same restraint. It's worth pausing here to say plainly that marriages this young were not the medieval norm whatever popular imagination sometimes assumes. Most peasants, as we touched on earlier, married in their 20s. Even among the gentry and nobility, plenty of families waited well past the legal minimum before allowing a marriage to be consummated at all. Margaret Beaufort's story stands out precisely because it was unusual, even by the standards of her own century, not because it was typical of how medieval people generally lived. 60 years after Isabella's wedding, in a very different corner of English history, a 12-year-old girl named Margaret Beaufort found herself married to a man twice her age, for reasons that had nothing to do with romance, and everything to do with a fragile, uncertain claim to the throne. Margaret's family carried royal blood descended from an earlier king, but blood alone wasn't enough. She'd been orphaned of her father as an infant, and by the time she was old enough to understand her own situation, she'd already been treated as a piece of valuable property for years passed between guardians who each recognized exactly what she represented. What made her valuable to the crown itself was the very real possibility that the reigning King Henry VI might die without children of his own, leaving the succession dangerously unclear in a kingdom already sliding towards civil war. Marrying Margaret to the king's own half-brother, a man named Edmund Tudor, was a calculated bet that their children might one day matter a great deal to the future of the crown. She'd actually already survived one earlier arranged marriage as a small child, barely old enough to speak in full sentences to a different family entirely, one that was quietly annulled before it ever became real. Margaret herself later in life refused to even count it. As far as she was concerned, her real married life began with Edmund. They wed in the autumn of 1455. Margaret was 12 years old. Edmund was 24. And here is the detail that I think deserves real attention, because it corrects a common assumption people carry into stories like this one. 12 may have been the legal minimum, but it was not even by the standards of that century considered a wise or expected age to actually consummate a marriage. The general custom, even among families with every incentive to move quickly, was to wait until a girl was closer to 14 specifically, because doctors and midwives of the period understood correctly that a body that young carried serious risk in pregnancy and childbirth. This wasn't some enlightened modern insight retroactively applied to the past. People at the time knew this. It was common knowledge, not a secret discussed openly enough that it shows up in surviving medical writing and household guidance from the period. Waiting those extra 2 years wasn't considered progressive or unusually kind. It was considered basic common sense. Edmund consummated the marriage anyway. We don't have Margaret's own words describing what that experience was like for her, and I'm not going to pretend to invent them for her here. What we do have is everything that followed, and it tells its own difficult story. Within a year, Edmund was captured during a violent stretch of civil conflict and died in captivity from what accounts of the time simply called plague, leaving Margaret a widow at 13 years old, 7 months pregnant, far from her own family, under the protection of her brother-in-law in a castle in Wales. She gave birth in January of 1457 in the depths of winter to a son she named Henry. The birth nearly killed her. Accounts from people who were actually present describe a labour so long and so dangerous that the people around her feared neither Margaret nor her baby would survive it. Her small unfinished frame simply wasn't built yet for what her body was being asked to do. Her own confessor, speaking about it decades later, called her survival nothing short of a miracle given how small and physically immature she still was at the time. She did survive, and so did her son. But something about that birth changed her permanently. Despite 2 further marriages later in her life, both of them, by most accounts, reasonably happy ones, Margaret never had another child. Historians now generally agree that the injury from that single birth at that age likely made it physically impossible. Can we just sit with that for a second? A 13-year-old girl widowed alone giving birth in a borrowed castle during a civil war, and somehow against every likelihood both she and her son lived. Because here's the part of Margaret's story that turns this from simply a tragedy into something far more complicated and honestly remarkable. That son she nearly died bringing into the world grew up to become King Henry VII of England, founder of an entire royal dynasty. And Margaret herself didn't fade quietly into the background afterward. She spent the rest of her long life as one of the sharpest political minds in the country, protecting her son's claim through decades of civil war, negotiating with kings, arranging alliances, occasionally outsmarting people who badly underestimated a small pious woman who'd survived something most of them couldn't imagine surviving themselves at any age, let alone 13. By the time her son finally took the crown, she'd earned herself a title of remarkable independence for a woman of her era, one that let her hold property, sign contracts, and manage her own affairs entirely outside her husband's control. A rare kind of freedom most medieval wives never came close to touching. I think about her often, actually, whenever people describe medieval women purely as passive victims of their circumstances. Margaret absolutely was a victim of a system that used her body as a political tool before it had finished growing. She was also later one of the most formidable operators of her entire era, someone who eventually helped decide who sat on the throne of England. Both of those things are true about the same person sitting side by side without cancelling each other out. History rarely offers you the tidy single lesson you'd like it to, and Margaret Beaufort, more than almost anyone else we'll meet tonight, refuses to be flattened into just one of them. If you're a parent listening to this tonight, I'll admit this next question isn't an easy one to sit with. How young is too young to ask someone to carry that kind of responsibility politically or otherwise? Medieval society had an official answer written into its laws backed up by its own doctors, and plenty of families quietly decided that answer didn't apply to them whenever ambition made waiting feel inconvenient. Margaret's story shows us exactly what that decision could cost, and it also shows us that a young woman treated as disposable by the system that used her could, given the chance, go on to outlast and outmaneuver nearly everyone who'd underestimated her. So we've now spent a good stretch of tonight's story on who got to choose a spouse, how much that choice cost, and how young someone could legally be pushed into it. But knowing the legal minimum age and even paying the correct dowry down to the last coin still wasn't enough to guarantee a marriage would actually hold up years down the line. The church had built an entire maze of additional rules underneath all of this, rules about family bloodlines stretching back for generations, about public announcements that had to be spoken aloud on the right days in the right order, about exactly how and where a couple needed to say their vows for any of it to count as legally real. Some of those rules existed for good reason, meant to protect people from being tricked or coerced. Others existed largely because they were profitable for the people enforcing them, which is a detail we'll get into properly very soon. Break the wrong rule in that maze even by pure accident, even without a single dishonest intention on anyone's part, and an entire marriage, no matter how carefully negotiated or how expensive the dowry attached to it, could quietly come undone years later, at the exact moment nobody expected it to matter anymore. And as it happens, we already met someone earlier tonight who found that out the hard way in about as public and consequential a fashion as it's possible to imagine. Let's actually walk through that maze properly, piece by piece, because once you understand how it worked, a few things we've already touched on tonight start to look a little different in hindsight. The first layer was the banns. Before any proper church wedding could go ahead, a couple's intention to marry had to be announced publicly out loud on 3 separate Sundays or holy days, usually at the church door itself, where the whole community would naturally be gathered anyway. This wasn't some quaint little formality. It was a built-in warning system. If anyone in the crowd happened to know that the groom already had a wife somewhere, or that the bride was secretly promised to another man, or that the two of them were more closely related than they were letting on, this was their moment to speak up before it became a legal permanent problem. Most people in this period couldn't make sense of a single word of any marriage contract, even if you'd handed them one. So a spoken public announcement repeated 3 separate times in front of witnesses was really the only practical safeguard available. Picture it for a moment. A cold Sunday morning, the whole village filing out of a small stone church after the service breath fogging in the air, and a priest reading out 2 names to everyone gathered, asking plainly whether any soul present knew a reason these 2 shouldn't marry. Most weeks silence. Nobody objected, everybody went home to their dinner, and the couple quietly moved 1 step closer to the altar. But every so often somebody in that crowd did know something. An old debt, a previous promise made to somebody else entirely. And suddenly a wedding that had seemed perfectly settled, could unravel right there in the churchyard in front of everyone who mattered to either family. The second layer, and the one that gets far stranger the deeper you dig into it, was blood. Under canon law, you couldn't marry a relative within a certain number of degrees of kinship. That much sounds sensible enough on its own. The trouble was how the church originally chose to count those degrees. For centuries, the rule stretched out to 7 degrees of separation, meaning you'd have to trace both family trees back through 7 generations before you could be entirely sure two people weren't secretly distantly related. In a world of small villages, tight-knit nobility, and endless intermarriage between the same handful of powerful families, this rule was quite frankly close to unworkable. By some estimates, if you enforced it strictly, huge portions of the European aristocracy would have technically been forbidden from marrying almost anyone remotely close to their own social rank. In the year 1215, at a major church gathering known as the Fourth Lateran Council, church leaders finally admitted the obvious and quietly reduced that boundary from 7 degrees down to 4. 4 generations back to a shared great-great-grandparent was still a remarkably wide net, wide enough to catch plenty of cousins who'd never once met each other in person. But at least it was something families could realistically track and plan around. Genealogists working for wealthy households truly earned their keep during this period, sometimes spending weeks tracing a prospective match's family tree back through 4 full generations just to make sure nobody had missed a shared ancestor buried somewhere in the branches. And here's where it gets interesting, because the church built itself a rather convenient escape hatch for exactly this problem. If a match fell just inside the forbidden degree of kinship, but both families desperately wanted the marriage to happen anyway, they could apply for something called a papal dispensation, essentially an official exception, granted directly from Rome, that allowed the marriage to proceed despite the blood relation. And I want you to notice something about how that system worked in practice. It wasn't free. Processing a dispensation request came with real fees, attached fees, that scaled up considerably for wealthier and more politically important families. Which meant in effect that the rule against marrying your relatives was for anyone with enough money and connections less of an absolute law and more of a toll booth. For a modest gentry family hoping to marry a distant cousin, to keep land within the family, that toll booth might mean a manageable fee and a wait of a few months while the paperwork travelled back and forth to Rome. For a royal house negotiating an alliance worth an entire kingdom, the stakes and the sums of money quietly changing hands to smooth the process along climbed considerably higher. The system was in its own strange way remarkably consistent. Everyone paid something. The powerful simply paid it faster, and occasionally, when the payment itself became inconvenient, skipped the paying entirely and went straight to forging the receipt. Would you have paid it if the alternative was losing an alliance worth an entire kingdom? Because one particular couple didn't just pay the toll. When Rome refused to even open the gate for them, they built their own gate, forged the paperwork, and drove straight through anyway. Their names were Ferdinand and Isabella, and in the autumn of 1469 they were about to change the shape of an entire continent. Isabella was heir presumptive to the crown of Castile, one of the 2 great Christian kingdoms of Spain. Ferdinand stood to inherit the neighbouring crown of Aragon. Marry them, and you'd effectively stitch 2 rival kingdoms into a single formidable power, stretching across nearly the entire Iberian Peninsula. Plenty of people saw that possibility coming from miles away, which is exactly why Isabella's own half-brother, the reigning King of Castile, actively worked to stop it from happening. He wanted a very different, far more politically convenient husband for her, one who'd keep her and her claim to the throne safely under his own control. At one point, according to several accounts from the period, he even entertained a marriage offer for her, purely because the suitor in question was willing to pay a fortune into the royal treasury for the privilege treating his own sister's future as one more item on a very long list of political bargaining chips. So Isabella did something bold. She slipped away from her brother's court under the polite excuse of visiting a family tomb and never came back. Ferdinand, for his part, crossed the entire width of Castile in disguise, dressed as an ordinary servant travelling with a group of merchants specifically to avoid the checkpoints his own future brother-in-law had set up to stop him. But even once the two of them finally reached each other safely, one enormous problem remained. Ferdinand and Isabella were second cousins, both descended from the same great-grandfather, which placed them squarely inside the forbidden degree of kinship. They needed a papal dispensation to marry legally, and the reigning pope at the time had absolutely no interest in granting one. He had his own political reasons for wanting to see this particular alliance fail, and he simply refused to sign. So they forged the signature of a different pope instead, one who happened to already be dead, with help from a well-connected cardinal, a young ambitious churchman named Rodrigo Borgia, who would himself later become one of the most notorious popes in history. Ferdinand and Isabella were presented with the supposed dispensation, backdated and signed in the name of a previous pope who had in fact been dead for 5 years by that point. Nobody involved seemed especially troubled by the technicality. The following day, October the 19th, 1469, in a modest palace in the city of Valladolid, the two of them were married anyway using a document that had quite literally been signed by a corpse's borrowed name. I have to imagine that's one of the boldest pieces of paperwork fraud in the entire history of European royalty, and it worked. A genuine dispensation eventually followed a few years later, quietly smoothing over the whole irregular business after the fact once it became politically convenient for Rome to simply look the other way. By then, though, the marriage had already happened, the alliance had already taken hold, a child was already on the way, and there wasn't much practical use left in objecting to it. Here's the detail I find most striking about all of this. That single, slightly fraudulent wedding is, by most historians' accounts, the foundation stone of modern Spain as a unified country. It's the marriage that eventually put the funding behind a certain Genoese sailor's wild plan to reach Asia by heading west across the ocean, a voyage that would go on to reshape the entire world in ways nobody standing in that modest palace could possibly have imagined. An entire chapter of world history quietly rests on two teenagers, a forged bull and a dead pope's stolen signature. Try sitting with that for a second. If a single church clerk somewhere in Rome had happened to notice the forgery before the wedding, if one suspicious guest had asked the wrong question at the wrong moment, the entire unification of Spain, the funding behind Columbus's voyage, arguably the whole shape of the following several centuries of world history, might never have happened at all, or might have happened in some completely different form we'd never recognize today. It's worth pausing here to notice how differently this same rule of blood and kinship could be used, depending entirely on who was holding the pen. For a queen looking to escape a marriage that no longer served her distant cousinship, could be the perfect legal exit, a technicality sharp enough to dissolve an empire's worth of complications overnight. For two ambitious teenagers desperate to enter a marriage everyone told them was forbidden, the exact same rule became an obstacle worth committing outright fraud to get around. Blood relation wasn't really the point in either case. Power was. The rule just happened to be whichever tool was lying closest at hand, sharpened or blunted depending entirely on whose hand was reaching for it. For an ordinary family without royal armies or a Borgia cardinal to call on, none of this flexibility was ever really on offer. A minor gentry household worried about a distant cousin marriage simply had to pay what modest fee they could scrape together and hope the paperwork came back from Rome before anyone's patience or reputation ran out. Now all of this, the bans, the dispensations, the careful paperwork trail describes what was supposed to happen. What actually happened, especially among people without royal armies or wealthy cardinals on speed dial, was often something far messier, because underneath this entire official system sat a strange legal loophole the church never quite managed to close no matter how hard it tried. Two people could become legally married simply by exchanging the right words to each other sincerely in private, with no priest, no bans, no witnesses beyond themselves. We've already seen exactly how powerful that loophole could be earlier tonight, when one young woman used it to defy her own family's wishes entirely. But it wasn't only used by the brave or the desperate. Plenty of ordinary couples simply preferred it, whether out of impatience, poverty, or a basic dislike of waiting 3 weeks and paying church fees for something they'd already decided between themselves. These clandestine marriages happened everywhere, under trees, in the back rooms of taverns, in kitchens, barns and open fields, anywhere two people could stand close enough to speak their promises to each other and mean it. Church councils across several centuries kept issuing fresh warnings against exactly this practice, over and over in tones that grow noticeably more exasperated the further along you look through them. Priests were instructed to preach against it regularly. Communities were reminded repeatedly that a proper marriage required bans and a blessing. And still, generation after generation, couples kept quietly marrying themselves in orchards and stairwells and market stalls after closing hours, apparently unbothered by how many sermons had been written specifically to stop them from doing exactly that. The church spent centuries trying to stamp this practice out repeatedly, insisting that proper marriages required bans of priest and public witnesses, and repeatedly discovering that people simply ignored the requirement whenever it suited them. And here's the maddening part from the church's own perspective. Even when they publicly condemned these secret unions as improper canon law, still technically recognized them as valid marriages once they'd happened. You could be scolded for marrying the wrong way. You generally couldn't be unmarried because of it. Which brings us back neatly to a quiet dawn wedding we opened tonight's story with. Think back to that small room in Grafton for a moment. A priest, a mother standing quietly by, 2 gentle women, a young man there to help with the singing, no bands called on 3 separate Sundays, no public announcement at any church door, no wider community gathered to raise an objection if one existed. By the strict letter of church procedure, that wedding was itself a form of clandestine marriage, valid almost certainly, but built on exactly the kind of quiet, undocumented foundation that could cause enormous trouble years later the moment anyone with a motive went looking closely enough at how it had actually happened. At the time, none of that seemed to matter in the slightest. A king had married the woman he wanted quietly and completely, and there was in that moment nobody around with either the power or the reason to challenge it. Marriages like this happened, went unquestioned, and simply stood for as long as nobody had a strong enough motive to dig into the paperwork. The trouble with skipping the official record keeping, though, is that it leaves a story with no independent witnesses beyond the handful of people who were there, and loyalties, unlike bans nailed to a church door, have an unfortunate habit of shifting over time. We're going to come back to that particular vulnerability later, because it mattered far more than anyone standing in that room could have guessed at the time. For now, though, let's step outside the church door entirely away from bans and bloodlines and forged paperwork and into something a little softer. Because once a couple actually cleared every single one of these legal hurdles, there was still the small matter of what they were actually going to wear to their own wedding. And the answer might surprise you more than you'd expect. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment before we go any further. If I asked you to picture a wedding dress right now, what colour came to mind first? I'd guess white. Almost everyone pictures white. It feels less like a fashion choice and more like a law of nature, something so obviously correct that questioning it barely occurs to most people. And that's exactly the assumption I want to gently take apart tonight, because it turns out the crisp white wedding gown most of us think of as timeless tradition is nowhere near as old as it feels. That particular fashion really only took hold after a young queen wore white to her own wedding in 1840, and the style caught on among wealthy families who wanted to copy her long after her lace and satin choice had already made headlines across an entire continent. Everything before that point, the entire medieval world we've been exploring tonight, operated on a completely different set of rules about what a bride actually wore, rules that had nothing to do with purity, as we understand the word today, and everything to do with money status and quiet coded messages sewn directly into the fabric itself. So let's talk colour for a moment, because colour in this period was never just decoration. It was information taken in at a glance by neighbours, guests and strangers alike, long before anyone exchanged a single word of greeting. Certain dyes were fantastically expensive to produce, and certain colours as a direct result became shorthand for exactly how wealthy your family was. A deep rich red, the kind that didn't fade to a dull brownish pink after a single wash, required imported dye that cost a small fortune, sometimes made from crushed insect shells shipped in from the Mediterranean, a detail that would have horrified plenty of the wealthy women proudly wearing it, had they ever stopped to ask exactly where the colour came from. Cheaper reds existed too, made from a common root plant grown much closer to home, but everyone who mattered socially could tell the difference between a cheap, dull madder red and the truly luxurious version. At a single glance, the same way a shopper today can spot the difference between a fast fashion coat and a properly expensive one without needing to check a single label. Blue held a slightly different kind of meaning tangled up with religious symbolism, since it was closely associated with the Virgin Mary, and by extension with purity and faithfulness. That single association is quite plainly the root of the something blue tradition people still casually mention at weddings today, even though most of them have no idea it traces back this far. Green carried its own layer of meaning, too often linked to new love and fresh beginnings, though later centuries would twist that same colour into a symbol of infidelity instead, which tells you something about how much these colour codes could shift, depending entirely on who was doing the interpreting and when. So if white wasn't the default, what were brides actually walking down the aisle in? Let me show you two very different weddings from almost exactly the same decade, because the contrast between them says more than I ever could just describing it in the abstract. The first belongs to a woman we've already spent time with tonight in a roundabout way. Remember the king from the very beginning of our story, the one who married in secret at dawn. He had a sister named Margaret, and in the summer of 1468, her own wedding turned into one of the most spectacular events medieval Europe had seen in a generation, held with none of her brother's secrecy, and every ounce of the pageantry his own wedding had deliberately avoided. She was marrying the Duke of Burgundy, a match meant to bind England and one of the wealthiest territories in Europe together through blood. The private wedding itself happened quietly before dawn, in a merchant's house, almost like an echo of her brother's own hushed ceremony years earlier. But the public celebration that followed was anything but hushed. For her ceremonial entrance into the city of Bruges, Margaret rode through the streets in a gilded litter, drawn by white horses' rein, apparently doing nothing to dampen the crowds lining every rooftop and window along the route. She wore a gown of white cloth of gold, trimmed in white ermine layered underneath a flowing crimson cloak, with a jewelled crown resting on her head. That crown, remarkably enough, still survives today. You can walk into a cathedral treasury in Aachen right now and see the exact piece Margaret wore on her wedding day over 5.5 centuries ago, pearls, enamelled roses and all, sitting behind glass for anyone curious enough to go looking for it. The spending behind the whole event was almost absurd. Records suggest the Duke spent more than 40,000 francs on silk and wool alone, just to dress his household appropriately for the occasion, an amount that would have supported an ordinary family for multiple lifetimes. The celebration stretched on for 10 full days filled with banquet-staged theatrical scenes, and a tournament built around an elaborate golden tree, an allegorical spectacle designed specifically to honour the new bride. That tournament left such a deep impression on the city that Bruges still reenacts it once every 5 years, centuries later drawing crowds who show up purely to watch a pageant built to celebrate a wedding. Almost nobody involved in organising it today has any personal connection to whatsoever. This kind of effort wasn't unique to Margaret's generation either. Nearly 2 centuries earlier, when a daughter of an English king married a Dutch count, the royal household paid a full team of 35 tailors to construct her wedding gown alone, working together for weeks purely on that single garment. Multiply that kind of labour across every layer of clothing, every guest, every servant dressed to reflect well on the family hosting the event, and you start to understand that a great medieval wedding wasn't really one dress. It was an entire small industry mobilised for a single afternoon. Now hold that image in your mind for a second, the gold cloth, the ermine, the crown that outlived the century it was made in, and travel with me somewhere very different. Not a palace, a merchant's household in Florence roughly 2 years earlier. A man named Luca Landucci ran an apothecary shop in the city, and like plenty of ordinary people of his era kept a diary jotting down prices, weather gossip, and the small domestic details that never made it into official chronicles written for kings and dukes. In it he described in real practical detail exactly what his own wife wore on their wedding day. Her outfit centred around a pale blue garment delicately embroidered with pearls paired with a purple gown, featuring sleeves woven from a patterned fabric called brocade, worn over a simple white undergown. There's no litter drawn by white horses in his account, no crown, no rain-soaked crowds cheering from rooftops. Just a proud husband decades before either of them could have guessed his private notebook would still be studied centuries later, carefully recording exactly what his bride looked like on the one day he clearly wanted to remember in detail. It's a beautiful outfit by any measure. It's also quite plainly a fraction of the spectacle Margaret's wedding involved appropriate for a comfortable, respectable merchant family, rather than a duchess binding 2 nations together through marriage. Would you have guessed that a shopkeeper's wife and a duchess were dressing from the same basic colour palette? Blues, purples, whites, just with wildly different amounts of money behind the fabric itself. It's the kind of detail that quietly collapses the distance between a diary entry and a royal chronicle, reminding you that both women were underneath the wealth gap doing the exact same thing on the exact same kind of morning. Because here's the thing that connects both of these women despite the massive gap in wealth separating them. Neither one wore white as we understand it today. Both of them wore layered, richly coloured garments chosen specifically because of what those colours communicated: purity, status, faithfulness, to a community that studied clothing the way we might study a resume today. A duchess and a shopkeeper's wife, separated by an ocean of money and title, were still in a strange way speaking the exact same visual language on their wedding day, just with wildly different budgets behind the sentence. And if you dropped even further down the social ladder past merchants and shopkeepers into an ordinary village household, the picture changes again quite dramatically. Most peasant brides didn't own a dedicated wedding dress at all. There was no separate garment reserved solely for the occasion, no once-in-a-lifetime purchase. A bride from a working family simply wore the finest clothing she already owned, whatever had been carefully kept aside for church visits and holy days mended and pressed for the occasion, and then worn again plenty of times afterward for entirely ordinary purposes. Often that meant a simple wool dress, in a plain reddish-brown shade, the natural colour of undyed wool from darker sheep, practical hard-wearing and completely unremarkable next to Margaret's cloth of gold. Fabric itself was too valuable and too labour-intensive to produce for anyone outside the wealthy classes to treat a wedding outfit as disposable one-day theatre never touched again. A single length of good wool cloth might represent weeks of spinning, weaving and dyeing before it ever became a garment at all, and no family scraping by on farm labour was going to retire something that valuable after a single afternoon. What these families could afford, though, was something small, portable and quietly symbolic. A length of blue ribbon tied around a small bundle of fresh rosemary sprigs, pinned somewhere on the bride's best dress or woven into her hair. Rosemary carried its own folk, meaning around love, memory and fidelity entirely separate from anything the church had officially sanctioned, a piece of genuine popular tradition passed down through ordinary households rather than handed down from clergy or nobility. It cost almost nothing to gather from a garden or hedgerow, and yet it let even the poorest bride participate in exactly the same colour symbolism the wealthiest duchess in Europe was paying a fortune to display in cloth of gold and imported dye. A sprig from a hedge and a scrap of ribbon worn with the same intention as a crown full of pearls. I find that detail quietly moving honestly. The specific meaning attached to the colour blue crossed every single social boundary this entire episode has spent so much time describing. Money bought scale, it bought ermine and gold thread and crowns that would outlast centuries. It never fully bought exclusivity over what the colour itself was allowed to mean. A duchess in Bruges and a farmer's daughter in some nameless village neither of us will ever hear about, again were on their respective wedding mornings reaching for the exact same symbol, for the exact same quiet reason, even if one of them paid for it in gold thread, and the other simply walked out to a hedgerow with a pair of scissors. Although I should mention wealth did buy one thing, poorer families were often legally barred from touching altogether, regardless of how much money they somehow managed to scrape together. Several medieval kingdoms passed what were known as sumptuary laws, legal restrictions dictating exactly which fabrics, furs, and even specific colours were reserved for which social ranks. England passed several rounds of these laws across the 14th century, spelling out in remarkable detail exactly which furs, which colours of cloth, and even how many buttons a man of a given rank was legally permitted to wear in public. The rules got specific enough to feel almost comical from a modern viewpoint, dictating precisely which categories of fur, ermine, sable, and their cheaper imitations belonged exclusively to which layer of the aristocracy, as though a person's entire moral and social worth could be judged straight off their coat collar at a glance. A merchant's wife, even a spectacularly wealthy one, could in certain times and places be legally prohibited from wearing the particular shade of scarlet, or the specific type of fur trim reserved by law for the nobility alone, no matter how many coins she was prepared to spend on it. Money could occasionally buy your way around these restrictions through fines or clever loopholes. Wealthy families quietly negotiated with local officials, but the underlying message was impossible to miss. Even something as personal as your own wedding outfit was in the eyes of the law still ultimately a question of exactly where you'd been born and what rank you'd been assigned within a rigid, carefully guarded social order. So the colour spoke, the fabric spoke, even the law occasionally spoke, whether a family liked what it had to say or not. But none of that, no matter how carefully chosen, actually got a couple married. Standing in the right colour, wrapped in the right fabric, still didn't make a single legal or spiritual difference on its own. For the marriage itself to count, for it to move from beautiful theatre into a bond, the church and the law would both recognise that same carefully dressed couple still had to walk to an actual church stand in front of an actual priest and go through a ceremony that, as it turns out, looked almost nothing like what most people today picture when they imagine a wedding. Because here's a detail that tends to truly surprise people the first time they hear it. That entire deeply meaningful moment we now think of as the heart of any wedding, the couple standing at the altar exchanging vows inside the church itself, wasn't actually where medieval marriages legally happened at all. All that careful attention to colour, to fabric, to status was about to walk straight past the church door and stop quite literally before the wedding party ever set foot inside the building at all. And once you understand exactly where that ceremony really took place, and how brief it actually was, you start to see the whole day very differently. Here's the detail that tends to catch people off guard every single time I bring it up. The part of a medieval wedding that actually made two people legally married didn't happen at an altar at all. It happened outside at the church door, sometimes called the church porch, in full view of the street, before anyone had even stepped foot inside the building. No candlelight, no aisle to walk down, no hushed, reverent silence settling over rows of seated guests. Just two people standing in the open air in front of whoever happened to be passing by, saying the words that would bind them together for the rest of their lives. And we know this wasn't some obscure regional quirk because one of the most famous writers in the English language built an entire joke around it. If you've ever studied English literature even briefly, you've probably run into Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, a sprawling collection of stories told by a group of pilgrims travelling together toward the shrine of St. Thomas Becket, and one character in particular tends to stick in people's memory more than almost any other, a bold, endlessly opinionated woman known simply as the wife of Bath. Chaucer introduces her with a line that would have landed as an immediate knowing joke to his original medieval audience. He tells us this worthy woman had over the course of her life taken 5 husbands, and he specifies exactly where each of those weddings happened, at the church door. That single detail, tossed off almost casually in the space of one line of verse, tells us something enormously useful about how thoroughly ordinary this custom was. Chaucer wasn't explaining an obscure ritual to confused readers who'd need the reference clarified in a footnote. He was making a punchline out of something everybody already understood perfectly well, the way a modern comedian might joke about someone's 5th trip down a courthouse aisle without needing to pause and explain what a courthouse wedding even is. If a 14th century audience laughed at that line without missing a beat, you can be fairly confident this wasn't some rare or regional practice. It was simply how weddings worked, common enough to be shorthand, common enough that naming the location alone was funnier than any elaborate description could have managed. So let's actually walk through what that door ceremony looked like, because the details are far richer and far stranger than most people expect. The version of this ceremony used across much of medieval England came from something called the Sarum Rite, a detailed set of religious instructions originally developed at Salisbury and gradually adopted by parishes throughout the country, right down to the precise wording spoken and the exact positions everyone needed to stand in. According to that text, the bride and groom were positioned quite deliberately before they said a single word. The man stood on the right, the woman stood on the left, and the reasoning given for that specific arrangement traces all the way back to an old piece of biblical symbolism, the belief that the first woman had been formed from a rib taken from the left side of the first man, so the living arrangement quite literally echoed the creation story every single time a couple stood together at that door, whether either of them consciously thought about the symbolism or not. Here's a detail I find quietly fascinating about the words themselves. Almost the entire wedding mass that followed inside the church would have been spoken in Latin, the standard language of the church across most of medieval Europe, understood fluently only by the clergy and a small educated minority among the guests. But the actual vows, the words that made the marriage legally real, were spoken in plain English right there in the open air, where anyone passing by could hear them clearly. The church understood correctly that consent given in a language you didn't understand wasn't really consent at all. So this one crucial section of an otherwise Latin ceremony broke from tradition entirely specifically, so the couple and everyone gathered around them could follow every single word without needing a translator standing nearby to explain what they'd just agreed to. And those words themselves carried a small but telling imbalance. The groom's vow promised faithfulness and support fairly close to what you might expect from a modern wedding vow worded around protection and provision. The bride's vow in several surviving versions of this ceremony included a promise to be in the language of the period bonny and buxom, an old expression that had nothing to do with either word's modern meaning and essentially meant good and obedient. Two people standing at the exact same door saying vows built from the exact same ceremony, spoken in the exact same plain English, and only one of them was formally promising obedience as part of the deal, written directly into the words the church itself had approved. I don't say that to score an easy point against the past. It's simply worth noticing quietly without needing to make a whole speech out of it, because it tells you something honest about where the balance of expectations sat in that relationship from the very first sentence either of them spoke to each other as husband and wife. Would you have caught that difference standing there as a guest, or would it have simply sounded like ordinary wedding language nobody thought twice about the way certain phrases in modern ceremonies slide past us today without anyone pausing to examine them closely? Here's something worth pausing on though, especially after everything we covered earlier tonight about how differently rich and poor families dressed for their weddings. This particular part of the day, the door, the positioning, the vows themselves barely changed at all based on how much money either family had. A duchess and a farmer's daughter might arrive at their weddings wrapped in wildly different fabric, but once they actually reached the church door, they were reciting nearly identical words, standing in nearly identical positions, bound by nearly identical rules laid out in the exact same Sarum text. Wealth bought a longer feast afterward. It bought better cloth, more musicians, a longer guest list. It didn't buy a different ceremony. In this one specific corner of medieval life, the legal and spiritual heart of the day treated a duchess and a dairymaid with something startlingly close to equal weight. Once the vows were spoken, the ceremony moved into the part most people today would actually recognize, the giving of the ring. Though even this had its own specific choreography, most modern couples have no idea their own tradition descends from. The groom held the ring, and speaking the words of the ceremony, slowly, deliberately moved it across the bride's fingers one at a time, pausing briefly at each stop, while the whole gathered crowd watched his hand travel across hers. First her thumb accompanying the words "in the name of the Father", then her index finger "and of the Son", then her middle finger "and of the Holy Spirit", and only then on the word "Amen" did the ring finally come to rest on her fourth finger, the one we still call the ring finger today, centuries later, without most people ever stopping to wonder why that particular finger became the standard, rather than any of the others it briefly touched along the way. The reasoning behind it wasn't random. Medieval scholars, drawing on ideas that stretched back centuries earlier to older writers who first proposed the theory, believed that a vein ran directly from that fourth finger, straight to the heart, a physical, literal connection binding hand to chest. Doctors of the period sincerely subscribed to this idea, and church writers repeated it confidently enough that it worked its way into the actual wording of wedding law itself, treated less like folklore and more like settled anatomical fact. It's completely inaccurate. Medically speaking, no such direct vein exists, and any doctor today could tell you as much within seconds. But the belief was sincere, specific, and taken seriously enough to permanently shape which finger billions of people worldwide still slide a ring onto today, almost 1,000 years after a handful of medieval scholars decided with total confidence and zero actual evidence that the heart and the hand were secretly connected. Here's a detail that tends to surprise people even more, though. The ring wasn't the only object placed on the priest's book to be blessed in that moment. Alongside it, the groom would often set down a small bag containing silver and gold coins, representing the financial promise he was making to his new wife, blessed together with the ring itself right there in front of the whole gathered community, priest family, neighbours, and whoever else had wandered over to watch. Think back to everything we discussed earlier tonight about dowries and financial arrangements. All those careful, sometimes tense negotiations conducted behind closed doors for weeks or months, beforehand letters exchanged, figures debated, terms haggled over long before either family ever set a date. This was the moment all of that quiet paperwork became public theatre coins, literally resting beside the ring as the priest blessed both, at once converting a private financial agreement into a public, sacred promise witnessed by an entire community standing in the street with no lawyer or notary required beyond the priest's own blessing and the crowd's collective memory of having seen it happen. Only once all of this had happened, the positioning, the vows, the ring moving finger by finger, the coins blessed alongside it, did the wedding party finally turn and walk through the church door they'd been standing in front of the entire time, moving from the porch to the altar for a proper wedding mass, the couple leading a small procession into a space filled with incense, candlelight, and whatever family and friends had managed to fit inside the building. But even that final step wasn't automatically guaranteed to everyone. The full nuptial blessing that traditionally accompanied this mass, an especially rich symbolic prayer, said over the couple, sometimes performed with a cloth or canopy, held above their heads to represent the household they were building together, was specifically tied to the idea of a first marriage. Widows and widowers marrying again would often find this particular blessing quietly withheld, the church reserving its most elaborate language for couples experiencing the sacrament for the very first time, which meant in practice that two people could walk through the exact same door, say remarkably similar vows, exchange an almost identical ring, and still end up with noticeably different ceremonies once they crossed that threshold, depending entirely on whether either of them had stood at a church door once before, married someone else, buried them, and come back around to try again. There's something quietly poignant about that distinction if you sit with it for a moment. A widow returning to that same doorway perhaps years later with a new partner beside her wouldn't receive quite the same blessing she'd received the first time, not because the church doubted the sincerity of her second marriage, but because the ceremony itself was built deliberately around the specific symbolism of a beginning that, strictly speaking, could only ever happen once. She'd still be married fully, legally and permanently in every sense the law and the church recognized. She simply wouldn't stand under quite the same canopy of words. A first-time bride stood beneath a small, quiet reminder, even in the middle of what should have been a joyful second chance, that this particular door remembered exactly how many times you'd walked through it before. I think what strikes me most about all of this is just how quick the actual legally binding portion of the whole event really was. Strip away the mass, strip away the feast and the music and the days of celebration that might follow afterward for a wealthy family, and the part of the day that truly mattered in the eyes of both church and law could be finished in a matter of minutes, a handful of sentences spoken outdoors, a ring moved across 4 fingers, a small bag of coins set down on a book. Compare that to how much modern couples spend planning a ceremony that, legally speaking, occupies maybe 60 seconds of actual binding vow language buried somewhere inside an hour of readings, music and speeches. The core of it hasn't really changed as much as you'd think. We've just added an enormous amount of decoration around a moment that was always at its heart remarkably brief. Everything else, the flowers, the music, the careful positioning at the door, the finger by finger, progress of that ring existed to dress up something the church could have technically finished in under a minute if nobody involved cared about ceremony at all. But people did care deeply, which is exactly why an entire village would gather in the street to watch 2 people say a few short sentences to each other. The brevity of the legal moment never seemed to diminish how much it mattered to everyone standing around watching it happen. Once that door ceremony wrapped up, though, and the couple had made their way inside for whatever version of the Mass their circumstances allowed, the truly loud part of the day was only just getting started outside those church walls. Because whatever happened at that quiet, solemn threshold was about to be followed by something considerably less solemn, entirely. Something involving considerably more noise, considerably more strangers crowded into one room, and if the surviving records are anything to go by, considerably more alcohol than anyone standing quietly at that church door might have predicted. Let's talk about the ale first, because it turns out an entire word we still use today, without ever questioning where it came from, was born directly out of exactly how loud these celebrations tended to get. Say the word bridal out loud for a second. Bridal shower, bridal party, bridal gown. It sounds like a fairly straightforward little adjective, doesn't it? Just a tidy way of saying something belongs to a bride, the kind of word you'd never think twice about while addressing wedding invitations. Except it isn't an adjective at all, not originally. It's 2 separate words that eventually fuse together after centuries of people saying them side by side so often that nobody bothered separating them anymore. Bride and ale. Because in Anglo-Saxon England, long before anyone called these celebrations wedding receptions, they called them bride ales, and the name meant exactly what it sounds like. A feast built quite literally around beer hosted in the bride's honour, where the drinking was every bit as central to the occasion as the marriage itself, sometimes stretching on for days depending on how much ale a household had managed to set aside. One of the earliest written mentions of the custom found in a chronicle from the 11th century describes a particular bride ale in language that essentially amounts to a warning, calling the whole rowdy affair a source of trouble for the men who attended it. The sort of blunt disapproving. A side-attired monk might scribble into the margin of a chronicle after hearing one too many stories from the village the morning after, which tells you these celebrations had already earned something of a reputation for chaos, centuries before anyone thought to write the word down for the very first time. Here's the part that truly surprised me the first time I came across it, though. In plenty of households, it wasn't simply that ale got served at the wedding. The bride herself often brewed it in large batches specifically to sell to her own guests during the celebration. Think about that for a moment. Rather than receiving gifts in the way modern couples do, a bride might spend the days leading up to her wedding, standing over a brewing vat stirring measuring timing, the whole batch carefully preparing enough beer to sell cup by cup to the very people who'd come to celebrate her marriage, using the proceeds to help fund the household she and her new husband were about to build together. It's essentially medieval crowdfunding run entirely on homemade beer and the simple social pressure of watching your neighbours buy a round, while you stood there empty-handed, unwilling to be the one guest who showed up and didn't pay their share toward the new couple's future, Would you have bought a cup from the bride herself, knowing full well the money was going straight toward her new home? I like to think most of us would have, if only because refusing a drink from the bride at her own wedding seems like exactly the kind of social misstep a village would still be gossiping about a decade later. Local authorities in several English towns eventually grew concerned enough about how these celebrations tended to unfold that they stepped in with actual regulations, specifically limiting how strong wedding ale was permitted to be. Sit with that fact for a second, because it's worth turning over slowly in your head. Someone somewhere sat down and decided the ordinary strength of beer wasn't the problem. It was specifically the strength of wedding beer that needed legal limits, as though weddings had earned their own separate elevated category of concern entirely distinct from everyday drinking. I don't think you pass a law like that unless the celebrations over and over gave the local authorities good reason to write it year after year, wedding after wedding, until somebody finally decided enough was enough and put it into writing. It's worth noting too that ale itself carried its own quiet class marker, the same way colour and fabric had earlier tonight. Wealthy households toasted their grandest weddings with imported wine shipped in from vineyards along the Rhine or the rivers of Bordeaux, poured for guests who'd never once needed to worry about brewing their own drink for anyone. Ordinary households meanwhile built their entire celebration around ale, brewed locally cheaply, and in whatever quantity the harvest allowed that particular year. Even the drink in your cup, in other words, was quietly announcing something about your family's standing before a single toast had been raised. Now, alongside all that ale, there was naturally food, and this is where the gap between wealthy and ordinary households opened up dramatically in ways that go far beyond what we discussed earlier tonight about clothing and colour. Let me show you something wonderful I stumbled across while looking into this. A wealthy Parisian merchant writing sometime around the end of the 1300s put together a household guidebook covering nearly every aspect of running a comfortable home, from gardening advice to instructions for training hawks to, most usefully for us tonight, a long collection of recipes and menus. Among that collection sat actual working notes for a real wedding feast his household had catered. And these notes survive word for word, giving us something remarkably rare, an honest, slightly harried behind-the-scenes account of what actually went into preparing a 14th century wedding dinner, written not for historians centuries later, but simply as a practical record for his own household to reference. The dinner, we're told, plainly was arranged for 20 guests. The planned courses included capon stewed with pomegranate and sugared almonds haunches of young goat, which the notes specifically insist taste better than lamb-roasted goslings, young chickens served with sauce, crayfish jelly and small rabbits. All of it accompanied by fresh napkins and towels for guests to wipe their hands between courses, since forks were still rare enough that most food travelled from plate to mouth by hand. It reads on the whole like an impressively organised, carefully considered menu, the kind of detailed planning you'd expect from someone determined not to embarrass his household in front of guests. And then tucked into the middle of all that careful planning, one small line that made me laugh out loud the first time I noticed it. Cherries none, because none could be found. I love that line more than almost anything else I've come across while researching tonight's story. 600 years later, and we still have direct written proof that even a wealthy, meticulously organised household planning a special occasion could still run head first into the exact same problem every single modern host has faced at some point. You plan the menu carefully, you account for the guests, the courses, the sauces, the fresh linens, and then at the very last minute one single ingredient simply refuses to show up, and you're left writing an apologetic little note explaining why the cherries never made it onto the table, presumably while someone in the kitchen quietly rearranged the fruit platter and hoped nobody would notice the gap. If that household existed today, I have a feeling that particular line would have shown up as a slightly panicked text message sent to a caterer at 11 o'clock the night before, followed immediately by someone frantically searching every grocery store within driving distance. Now scale that same basic instinct, the desire to impress your guests through food, all the way up to a royal household, and the whole event transforms into something almost theatrical. Great medieval banquets, the kind wealthy noble families staged for their most important weddings and grandest occasions, didn't simply serve food. They staged it treating dinner as a form of theatre performed course by course in front of a captive, appreciative audience. Between courses, kitchens would produce what were known as subtleties, elaborate sculptures built from sugar marzipan, or pastry shaped into birds, castles, coats of arms, entire miniature scenes, designed purely to be looked at and admired before anyone touched a single bite. At one particularly famous royal feast from this period, the showpiece between courses was a confectionery swan surrounded by a flock of cygnets, each one carrying a tiny scrap of poetry in its beak, followed by dozens more swans parading out afterward to complete the verse, line by line, an entire narrative poem delivered course by course through sugar sculpture alone. It's less a dessert course and more a piece of temporary architecture built entirely out of sugar gone within the hour existing, purely to be marvelled at once before it vanished the culinary equivalent of a fireworks display that also happened to be at least in theory edible. And then there were the birds that weren't sculptures at all, the real ones prepared using a technique that sounds almost unbelievable the first time you hear it described. Cooks would carefully remove the skin and feathers from a peacock or a swan, cook the meat separately, and then reattach the skin and plumage afterward, presenting the finished bird at the table, looking at a glance exactly as if it had simply strutted in and sat itself down among the other dishes, tail feathers fanned out, head held high, entirely unbothered by the fact that it had been thoroughly cooked underneath its own restored skin. Guests must have spent half the meal debating whether it was safe to actually cut into the thing. The goal was never really about flavour, and by most accounts these birds weren't especially delicious to begin with. It was about spectacle, a wordless way of announcing to every single guest seated at that table exactly how much wealth and effort a family was willing to spend purely to impress them for a single afternoon. Now travel with me one more time tonight away from that kind of theatre entirely back down to an ordinary village wedding, because the contrast couldn't be sharper. There were no sugar swans waiting at a peasant wedding feast. No refeathered peacocks staged for maximum drama. What there was instead was community. In smaller villages, the cost and labour of feeding an entire wedding party often fell not on one family alone, but on the whole neighbourhood. Everyone contributing whatever they could manage, a portion of bread. Here a cut of meat, there a jug of homemade ale, from whoever's household had brewed a batch that season. Something close to what we'd now recognise instantly as a potluck dinner, except with far higher stakes riding on whether the harvest that year had been generous or lean. Nobody walked away particularly dazzled by the presentation. What they walked away with instead was the simple practical knowledge that an entire community had come together, cooked together and eaten together to send one couple off into married life properly fed and properly supported by the people who'd go on being their neighbours for the rest of their lives. I find something quietly moving in that difference, honestly. A noble wedding feast was built to display wealth to guests who mostly already had plenty of their own, a performance stage for people who needed no convincing of the family's status. A village wedding feast was built from whatever a whole community could scrape together collectively freely given, rather than purchased for effect, and somehow that collective effort managed to say something a sugar swan never could. One kind of feast told guests how rich a family was. The other told a young couple exactly who'd be standing beside them the next time the harvest failed, or the roof needed mending, or a child fell ill in the middle of winter. Music and entertainment filled the gaps between all of this eating and drinking too, regardless of which end of the social ladder you happen to be standing on. Minstrels moved through wealthier households, paid performers trained to sing play, and keep a room's energy from ever sagging between courses. Jugglers and travelling performers turned up wherever a crowd had gathered, often uninvited but rarely turned away, since a good performer drew a crowd that was good for everyone's mood. And even the humblest village celebration usually found room for someone with a decent singing voice, or a fiddle willing to keep the dancing going long after the food itself had run out, trading a few hours of music for their share of the ale and whatever leftovers the feast produced. Picture yourself at either version of this celebration for a second. Would you rather be dazzled by trained musicians and sugar sculptures inside a noble hall, or packed into a crowded village green with your entire community dancing to whoever happened to own a fiddle that year? I suspect most of us, if we're honest, would have more fun at the second one, even if the first one photographed better. And once the food was gone, the ale had been poured and re-poured more times than anyone could count, and the music had finally started winding down toward evening. The day still had one more considerably more private tradition left to get through. Except calling it private might be generous, because what actually happened next involved considerably more witnesses crowded into a considerably smaller room than anybody standing at that feast table might have expected, and considerably less dignity than either the bride or groom had probably hoped for on what was supposed to be the most romantic night of their lives. Here's something that tends to properly startle people the first time they picture it clearly. In plenty of medieval households, particularly wealthier ones, a new husband and wife did not simply slip away quietly at the end of the night to enjoy a private moment together. They were escorted by a crowd, sometimes a fairly large one carrying candles and grinning the entire way down the corridor. Once the feast wound down and the music started fading, it became customary for the wedding guests, family friends, sometimes half the village, to form a procession and walk the bride and groom straight to their own bedchamber, laughing, joking, carrying candles, making the whole journey down the hallway feel less like a private moment and more like a parade with exactly one destination in mind. Why would anyone want an audience for that? It sounds almost unbearable to imagine today, and yet the custom persisted in various forms across huge stretches of medieval and early modern Europe, showing up in household records, court chronicles, and the grumbling complaints of more than one embarrassed bride. Part of the answer is simply human nature. People love an excuse to tease a nervous couple, and a wedding night gave the whole community exactly that sanctioned, expected entirely public teasing, the medieval equivalent of every awkward toast a best man has ever given at a modern reception, except stretched out across an entire evening and delivered directly outside the bedroom door. But there was a second, more practical reason lurking underneath all the giggling and candlelight, something closer to insurance than entertainment, a way of making sure a marriage couldn't later be quietly denied by anyone who'd changed their mind about it. We'll get into exactly how that worked very soon, because it involves something considerably more serious than jokes. For tonight, though, let's stay with the chaos itself, because it deserves its own space to breathe before we get anywhere near the serious part. Once the crowd reached the bedchamber, the couple didn't simply climb into bed while everyone politely filed out. Guests actively participated in getting them there, and this is where things tended to get delightfully out of hand. It became something of a sport among the wedding party to grab at the bride's clothing, as she was being undressed for bed, snatching at ribbons, garters, stray bits of fabric purely for luck. The belief was that a small piece of the bride's wedding attire carried good fortune with it, and apparently good manners went straight out the window the moment that belief took hold of a room full of excited guests who'd already been drinking for several hours. Picture it properly for a second. A small bedchamber packed shoulder to shoulder with laughing relatives and neighbours, everyone reaching, grabbing, competing over scraps of fabric, while a mortified bride tried to keep some shred of dignity intact in the middle of it all. You can probably guess where this is going. Brides understandably grew tired of having their clothing grabbed at and half torn off by over-enthusiastic guests every single time they got married, so a small practical compromise developed over time. Rather than let the crowd fight over her actual garments, the bride, or sometimes the groom on her behalf, would simply remove her garter herself and toss it out to the waiting crowd, letting them scramble and dive for it, the way you might throw a bouquet today. It solved the immediate problem: fewer torn dresses, marginally less chaos, while still giving the guests exactly the lucky souvenir they'd been so determined to grab in the first place. It's a small practical piece of social engineering, really a community negotiating its own rowdiest instincts down into something slightly more manageable, without ever quite managing to eliminate the instinct itself. Would you have joined that scramble, diving for a scrap of ribbon on the theory that it might bring you good luck of your own? Or would you have hung back at the edge of the room, quietly embarrassed for everyone involved? The tradition didn't stop there either. Once the couple were actually in bed, guests sometimes kept the game going a little longer, taking turns throwing one of the groom's own stockings backward over their shoulder, without aiming blindly in the general direction of the bed. Whoever managed to land their stocking squarely on the bride or groom's nose, so the superstition went, would themselves be the next person in the room to get married. Picture that scene properly for a second. A newly married couple sitting up in bed trying to look composed and dignified, while a rotating cast of tipsy wedding guests took turns, hurling wool stockings at their faces, cheering every time someone scored a direct hit, groaning theatrically every time a throw sailed wide and thumped harmlessly against the headboard instead. It's the kind of scene that sounds more at home in a modern comedy sketch than a solemn medieval religious institution, and yet it happened repeatedly, across generations, precisely because everybody involved, apart from perhaps the two people actually sitting in that bed, seemed to be having a wonderful time. Eventually, mercifully, the guest would leave, the candles would be carried back out, and the couple would finally actually be left alone. Now all of this, the grabbing, the stocking, throwing the candlelit procession down the hallway, tended to happen with the most enthusiasm in wealthier households, where there were simply more guests, more wine, and more room in a large manor bedchamber to fit a crowd comfortably. In smaller village households, the custom scaled down accordingly, sometimes reduced to little more than a handful of close family members, walking the couple to bed and offering a few good-natured jokes before leaving them alone for the night without the elaborate stocking games or the crush of dozens of guests fighting over ribbons. A poorer household simply couldn't spare the ale, the crowd, or the space for the full spectacle, and honestly, most newlyweds probably weren't complaining about the smaller audience. The impulse behind it stayed exactly the same at every level of society, the same instinct toward public witness dressed up as celebration. Only the size of the audience and the volume of the chaos really changed depending on how much house and how much beer a family had to spare. But here's where the story stops being simply funny and starts becoming quietly important, because at least one royal wedding night from this exact era left behind detailed enough records that we can walk through almost the entire evening, and the consequences of that single night would go on to reshape the English monarchy itself, decades later, in ways nobody standing in that room could have possibly predicted. In November of 1501, a 15-year-old Spanish princess named Catherine married Arthur, Prince of Wales, heir to the English throne, in a lavish ceremony at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Arthur himself was also just 15 slight, and by several accounts not in the strongest health. This wasn't simply a fashionable society wedding. It was the culmination of years of careful diplomacy between two royal houses sealing an alliance between England and Spain that both sides had spent an enormous amount of time and money negotiating. Catherine had been promised to Arthur since she was a small child, and by the time she finally set foot in England to marry him, an entire nation's foreign policy had quietly come to rest on her shoulders, carried across the sea, along with a dowry substantial enough to make the match worth all the trouble. If any of this sounds familiar, that's because Catherine's own parents are the very couple we spent time with earlier tonight, the ones who once used a forged document signed in a dead pope's name to marry each other against everyone's wishes. Apparently boldness ran in the family. The wedding itself was magnificent days of feasting and celebration, exactly in the spirit of everything we discussed earlier tonight, elaborate enough that guests reportedly needed refreshments brought to them partway through, simply because the ceremony itself ran on for so long, both teenagers standing through hours of Latin liturgy trumpets and formal procession before either of them had a chance to actually speak to one another as husband and wife. And it ended predictably with the traditional bedding ceremony, the couple escorted to their chamber by the assembled court, exactly the kind of noisy candlelit procession we've just spent the last several minutes describing, except staged this time in front of an entire royal household rather than a handful of village neighbours. What actually happened once everyone left the room has been argued about for over 5 centuries now, and here's the maddening part. We honestly don't know for certain, and probably never will, because the two witnesses who mattered most left behind completely contradictory accounts, each one convinced of their own version of events. The following morning, according to more than one servant present in the household, young Arthur emerged from the bedchamber in remarkably good spirits, striding out and calling loudly for a cup of ale in front of anyone within earshot, because in his own words he had spent the night in the midst of Spain, adding for good measure that marriage was thirsty work. It's exactly the kind of boastful, slightly ridiculous thing you'd expect from a 15-year-old boy eager to seem more experienced than he actually was, performing confidence in front of an audience of grown men, whether or not anything of substance had actually happened between the sheets. Teenage boys, whatever century you find them in, have never been especially reliable narrators of their own romantic conquests. But Catherine's own attendant, the woman responsible for dressing and undressing her that night, told a very different story. According to her account, the young princess seemed plainly upset the next morning, and nothing in her telling had happened at all. So which one do we believe, a bragging teenage boy performing for an audience of servants or a young woman's own attendant, describing what she claimed to have witnessed firsthand? Historians have debated this exact question for longer than most countries have existed in their current form, and there simply isn't a way to settle it conclusively from where we're standing now. If you had to choose right now whose version you'd trust more, the boasting boy or the loyal attendant, which way would you lean, and why I find I change my mind about it almost every time I sit down and think it through properly. Here's why any of this actually matters beyond simple curiosity about one royal couple's private business. Arthur died only months after the wedding struck down by illness, while the two of them were living together in Wales, leaving Catherine, a 15-year-old widow in a foreign country thousands of miles from her own family, uncertain what would happen to her next. She would eventually marry Arthur's own younger brother instead, a boy named Henry, who was at the time of that first wedding watching the whole spectacle as a 10-year-old child standing somewhere in that same cathedral, likely bored out of his mind through most of the ceremony, with absolutely no idea he'd one day marry the bride himself. Neither Catherine nor young Henry nor anyone else in that wedding party that night could possibly have guessed that the exact question of what did or didn't happen in that bedroom would decades later become one of the most consequential legal disputes in the entire history of the English monarchy. A question so significant it would eventually help pull England away from the authority of Rome, altogether reshape the line of succession and set the stage for one of the most turbulent royal marriages in European history. A single unwitnessed night remembered differently by everyone who claimed to know something about it somehow became load-bearing for the future of an entire kingdom. We'll get properly into why that single night carried so much legal weight very soon, because the reasons behind it reveal something quietly fascinating about how seriously medieval society treated the line between a marriage that existed only on paper and one that had, in the eyes of both church and law, actually been completed. For now, though, sit with the strangeness of it for a moment. Somewhere in a candlelit room in London over 500 years ago, a nervous teenage boy either did or didn't spend a few private hours with his new bride, and that single unknowable fact would go on to reshape an entire country's relationship with the Catholic Church, unravel a marriage, launch a new one, and eventually help produce one of the most famous, most ruthless kings in English history. All hinging on a boast about ale and a servant's memory of one quiet, contradicted morning. It turns out that the raucous candlelit chaos we've spent the last several minutes laughing about carried a legal weight most of the people throwing stockings at each other's faces never fully stopped to consider. Because in the eyes of the law and in the eyes of the church, a marriage sealed only by vows at a door and a ring moved across 4 fingers was still in a very real sense unfinished business, and what happened or didn't happen once that bedroom door finally closed could end up mattering a great deal more than anyone dancing in the hallway that night ever imagined. So why did any of this matter so much to the law and to the church that an entire wedding night could end up shaping the future of a kingdom? Why did a single closed door carry that much legal weight when everything else about a marriage, the vows, the ring, the blessing, had already been spoken out loud in front of an entire community? Here's the piece of the puzzle we haven't quite connected yet. Under canon law, a marriage sealed only by spoken vows, the kind we walked through at that church door earlier tonight, was real and binding, but it wasn't yet permanent in the fullest legal sense. There was still one door left open. A marriage that had never been physically completed could, under specific circumstances, be undone entirely annulled, as though it had never properly existed at all. The 2 people involved free to walk away and marry someone else without a single stain of scandal attached. Consummation was the final lock on that door. Once it happened, the marriage became, in the eyes of both church and state, essentially unbreakable, permanent in a way almost nothing else in medieval life truly was. Until it happened, a surprising amount still hung in the balance, no matter how grand the ceremony had been, or how many witnesses had gathered to watch the vows exchanged, which meant that what took place behind a closed bedroom door wasn't simply a private matter between 2 people. It was quietly one of the most legally significant moments of the entire marriage, the difference between a bond nobody could touch and one that could still, in the right circumstances, be unwound, completely treated by the law as though it had never happened at all. The vows spoken at that church door reduced to nothing more than words once a judge decided the marriage had never truly been finished. And the church didn't stop at simply caring whether a marriage had been consummated. It had opinions about how to. According to church teaching through much of this period, legitimate marital relations were expected to follow a single accepted position, one considered most likely to result in conception since procreation. Not pleasure was understood as the entire moral justification for the act within marriage in the first place. Enjoying it too visibly, or straying from that one approved approach, could technically be treated as its own quiet sin, even between a lawfully married husband and wife, something to confess later in whispered detail to a priest who'd heard it all before. Try sitting with that for a second. An institution powerful enough to shape international treaties and topple kingdoms also felt entitled to weigh in on the mechanics of a couple's bedroom down to the exact position they were permitted to use, treating something as intimate and human as this, as though it were just another matter for canon law to regulate right alongside bans and dowries and forbidden degrees of kinship. Would it have even occurred to most couples going about their private lives that a bishop somewhere had opinions about this too? Or did most people simply live their lives quietly and let the theologians argue among themselves? So what happened when a marriage simply never got consummated at all year after year with no explanation anyone was willing to offer publicly, and no way for either spouse to simply move on quietly? It went to court, and the resulting proceedings, known broadly as impotence trials, produced some of the most invasive, uncomfortable legal spectacles medieval and early Renaissance Europe ever staged, dressed up in the full formal language of church law, complete with sworn witnesses, official examiners, and carefully recorded testimony that could determine an entire family's future. These weren't rare, whispered about scandals confined to a handful of unlucky households either. They were a recognized functioning part of how ecclesiastical courts handled marriages that had quietly stalled a formal mechanism built specifically to answer a question most people today would consider entirely too private for any courtroom to touch. Let me walk you through one particular case because it's real, it's thoroughly documented, and it happens to connect directly to a family we've already spent time with earlier tonight. His name was Henry, and in 1454 he became King of Castile, one of the two great Christian kingdoms of Spain. History rather unkindly remembers him by a nickname that followed him for the rest of his life, and straight into the history books afterward. They called him Henry the Impotent, a label so thoroughly attached to his name that it appears in encyclopedias and history textbooks to this day, centuries after everyone involved in the original scandal has been dead and buried. The trouble began years earlier with his first marriage to a princess named Blanche of Navarre. The wedding took place when Henry was still a teenager, arranged as part of a political treaty between two neighbouring kingdoms, exactly the kind of calculated match we've spent so much of tonight discussing, and the marriage continued on paper at least for 13 full years. 13 years of shared meals, shared households, shared public appearances as husband and wife, and not a single child to show for any of it. In a royal household where producing an heir wasn't simply a personal milestone, but a matter of national stability, the entire future of a dynasty resting on one couple's ability to conceive that kind of prolonged silence eventually became impossible to ignore. Whispered about at first, and then eventually impossible to keep quiet any longer. So Henry's court did what any respectable institution facing a legal problem in this period tended to do. It formally investigated, treating the entire matter with the same careful bureaucratic seriousness it might have applied to a disputed land boundary or a broken trade agreement. What followed is frankly one of the more astonishing legal procedures you'll come across in this entire story. Officials arranged for Blanche to undergo a physical examination conducted by matrons, appointed specifically for the task, the results of which confirmed she remained after 13 years of marriage still a virgin. That much settled one side of the question cleanly and clinically. But settling whether the fault lay with Henry required an entirely different and considerably stranger form of investigation. According to the records that survive, a priest was sent to question several women working in the city of Segovia, women employed in what we might delicately call the oldest profession, and they reportedly testified under formal questioning that Henry was perfectly capable in exactly the way his marriage had failed to demonstrate. Think about that for a moment. A king's most private, humiliating personal failure, argued out formally in front of church officials using testimony gathered from sex workers, brought in specifically to speak to his abilities, all of it recorded, filed and preserved well enough that historians are still discussing the details more than 5 centuries later in exactly the kind of detail he almost certainly never wanted made public in his own lifetime. No modern courtroom, no matter how invasive, would dream of assembling a jury quite like that one. Would you have wanted your own most private struggles decided by a formal court hearing testimony like that, with the outcome then attached to your name for the rest of recorded history, repeated in textbooks by people who never knew you and never would? The marriage was annulled in 1453. Blanche was sent home to Navarre free to eventually remarry someone else entirely, and Henry, despite everything the priest's investigation had apparently concluded about his abilities elsewhere, could not shake the reputation that scandal had attached to him. The nickname stuck immediately, and it never let go, following him into every subsequent negotiation, every whispered conversation among rival nobles sizing up his weaknesses, every later argument about whether he was even fit to rule. Even now, centuries later, in most history books, encyclopedias, and casual conversations about Spanish royalty, he is still first and foremost Henry the Impotent, a label that has quietly outlived every other achievement or failure of his entire reign, reducing an entire life spent governing a kingdom down to one humiliating word attached permanently to his name. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn, because the scandal didn't end with one annulment. Henry remarried this time to a Portuguese princess named Joanna, hoping presumably that a fresh start with a new wife would finally lay the old rumours to rest. And for 6 more years the exact same troubling silence returned. No children, no heir. The same rumours, the same doubts resurfacing all over again, louder this time, because everyone already had a nickname ready and waiting for exactly this situation, and 6 childless years only seemed to confirm what half the court had already decided to believe about him. Then, in 1462, nearly a decade into this second marriage, Joanna finally gave birth to a daughter. You might expect that to have settled the matter once and for all, proof at last that the king was capable of fathering a child, silencing every rumour in one triumphant announcement. Instead, it did the opposite. Rumours spread almost immediately that the baby's real father wasn't Henry at all, but a nobleman close to the Queen, a court favourite she was widely believed to have taken as a lover. The girl grew up carrying a cruel nickname of her own, based directly on her suspected father's name, a label that followed her every bit as relentlessly as her father's own nickname had followed him. 2 people forever defined in the history books by rumours about their bedrooms, rather than anything they actually accomplished. That single disputed birth didn't stay a private family matter for long. It exploded into a full-blown succession crisis, nobles taking sides, rival claims to the throne, forming around it years of civil conflict over who truly deserved to rule Castile, once Henry died, an entire kingdom's stability, quietly resting on a question nobody could ever fully answer. And if you were paying close attention earlier tonight, you might already recognize where this is heading, because the woman who eventually emerged from that entire mess to claim the throne for herself was Henry's own half-sister, the very same determined young woman who once forged a dead pope's signature just to marry the man of her own choosing. One king's private humiliating court case, argued out using testimony from strangers hired specifically to discuss his body, ended up reshaping the entire line of succession for the future crown of a unified Spain. It's the kind of consequence nobody standing in that examination room could possibly have predicted at the time. A formal bureaucratic hearing about one man's private failures somehow rippling outward across decades until it helped decide who would eventually rule an entire continent's worth of territory. I keep coming back to how deeply personal all of this actually was underneath the formal Latin proceedings and the careful legal language. These weren't abstract legal debates conducted at a comfortable distance from anyone's actual feelings. They were real people forced to have their most private failures, real or invented, argued out in front of priests, officials, and in Henry's case, women paid specifically to weigh in on a subject that should never have needed outside witnesses in the first place. A modern person going through something similar would at the very least expect privacy, perhaps a quiet conversation with a doctor behind a closed door. Medieval and early Renaissance Europe offered almost none, especially not if you happened to sit on a throne, where your body's most intimate failures instantly became a matter of state, filed away alongside treaties and tax records for later historians to pick through. It makes you wonder how many quieter, less politically consequential versions of this exact story happened in ordinary households, two away from royal courts and official records, couples struggling silently with something nobody around them had the language, the privacy, or the kindness to discuss gently. For every Henry argued about in formal court proceedings that survived long enough for us to study today, there were surely countless ordinary husbands and wives facing the exact same private heartbreak, with no priest, no examination, and no historical record at all. Just a quiet, unspoken sadness that never made it into any surviving document. There's a strange, uncomfortable thread running underneath everything we've covered so far tonight if you step back and look at the whole shape of it. Secrets once exposed in the right hands at the right moment had the power to unmake even a king, to turn a private, humiliating detail into public political ammunition, capable of reshaping an entire kingdom's future. We actually open tonight's entire story with exactly that kind of secret, a quiet, undocumented wedding that nobody outside one small room in Grafton was ever meant to know about, sealed with no banns, no public announcement, barely 5 witnesses standing in a dawn-lit room. At the time, it must have felt safely buried, tucked away where no ambitious rival could ever reach it. But as we've just spent this entire episode discovering secrets involving marriage consummation and legitimacy, rarely stayed buried for long in this world, no matter how carefully they'd been hidden away. And it's finally time to go back and see exactly what happened when that particular secret stopped being a secret at all, and exactly what it cost the people standing closest to it once the truth finally came out. The council chamber at Reading Abbey would have been full that September morning, benches packed with some of the most powerful men in England, all of them gathered to settle once and for all exactly who their king was going to marry the heir, thick with the kind of formal anticipation that comes before a major diplomatic announcement everyone assumed they already knew the ending to. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. The very same nobleman who'd helped put Edward on the throne in the first place stood ready to finalise months of careful diplomatic work. He'd been negotiating for a French match, a marriage to Bona of Savoy, sister-in-law to the King of France himself, and he was due to travel abroad within weeks to settle the final details in person. As far as Warwick understood the situation, this was simply a formality left to complete a signature, away from securing the exact alliance England needed. Edward stood up in front of that entire gathered council and told them he couldn't marry Bona of Savoy. He was already married. Picture the silence in that room for a moment. Not confusion, not polite surprise. Something closer to stunned disbelief settling slowly over a chamber full of men who prided themselves on knowing exactly what was happening in their own kingdom. And then to make the announcement land with maximum force, Edward had his new queen brought forward and formally presented to the entire court, walking in on the arm of his own younger brother, a 14-year-old boy named George. Elizabeth Woodville, the quiet widow we watched Edward marry in secret at the very start of tonight's story, was suddenly standing in front of England's most powerful nobleman as their undisputed queen with absolutely no warning given to any of them beforehand. For Warwick specifically, this wasn't simply awkward news to absorb. It was a calculated humiliation, whether Edward fully intended it that way or not. He'd spent months representing England's interests abroad, building relationships, negotiating terms, only to discover in front of the entire assembled court that the king he served had quietly made all of that work pointless months earlier and simply never bothered to mention it. Every letter he'd written, every promise he'd made to the French court on Edward's behalf, had just been rendered worthless in a single sentence, delivered without so much as a private warning beforehand. Worse still, Elizabeth's own father had fought against Edward's side in the very same civil war that had put Edward on the throne to begin with. Warwick hadn't just lost a diplomatic victory. He'd watched the king he'd helped crown hand real power and influence directly to a family that had until quite recently been actively fighting against everything Warwick himself had risked his life for. Would you have forgiven that kind of blindsiding if you were standing in Warwick's position that morning, watching your own careful diplomacy get quietly erased in front of an entire room of your peers with no warning and no apology offered afterward? Warwick, as it turned out, did not forgive it. Not really, not ever in any way that mattered. What followed over the next several years reads less like court gossip and more like a slow-motion collapse of one of medieval England's most important political partnerships. The Woodvilles. Elizabeth's large and suddenly very well-connected family rose rapidly in wealth and influence, married strategically into some of the most powerful noble houses in the country, and began quietly displacing the very Neville family Warwick had spent his life building up. Positions at court marriages to wealthy heirs and heiresses, prestigious appointments that once would have gone automatically to Warwick's own relatives, all began flowing steadily toward Elizabeth's siblings and cousins. Instead, a whole new family suddenly occupying rooms and offices the old nobility had always assumed belonged to them by birthright. Resentment simmered for years, tangled up with older grievances about foreign policy patronage, and exactly whose advice the king was actually listening to. By the end of the decade, resentment had curdled into open rebellion. Warwick allied himself with Edward's own younger brother, the very same George who'd once walked Elizabeth Woodville into that council chamber, now a grown man hungry for more power than being merely the king's brother could offer him. Together they raised an army against Edward directly. For a brief extraordinary period in 1469, the man who had once helped crown Edward literally held him prisoner and used the opportunity to execute several members of Elizabeth's own family, including her father, purely to punish the king through the people he loved most, a chilling demonstration of exactly how personal medieval political revenge could get. Edward eventually regained his freedom, and for a while an uneasy peace held between the two men. It didn't last. Warwick's final break came when he did something almost unthinkable for a man of his standing. He switched sides, entirely abandoning the Yorkist cause he'd spent his whole career fighting for, and allying himself instead with the very Lancastrian queen his side had originally driven into exile. To seal the alliance, he married his own daughter to the Lancastrian heir to the throne. The man once celebrated as the great kingmaker of the House of York was now actively working to bring down the king he himself had made, dedicating the same ruthless political instincts that once built Edward's crown toward destroying it instead. For a short, chaotic stretch of English history it actually worked. Edward was driven from his own kingdom, entirely forced to flee across the sea to safety, while his pregnant wife sought refuge inside the walls of Westminster Abbey, claiming the ancient right of sanctuary, rather than risk capture by her husband's enemies. Picture that for a moment. a crowned Queen of England, heavily pregnant, reduced to hiding inside a church with a handful of loyal servants, while somewhere across the water her husband tried desperately to rebuild an army and reclaim a throne that only months earlier had seemed completely secure. It was there inside those walls, surrounded by the last few loyal servants she'd left, that Elizabeth gave birth to Edward's first son, a boy who would one day briefly wear his father's crown, born not in a palace surrounded by celebration, but in hiding while his father's throne sat occupied by someone else entirely. Edward did not stay defeated for long. He returned to England, rebuilt his forces, and met Warwick on the battlefield one final time in the spring of 1471. The two men who had once ruled England together side by side, planning campaigns and sharing counsel, ended their partnership on opposite sides of a bloody field, fighting through thick fog that made it nearly impossible to tell friend from enemy. By the end of that single day, Warwick was dead, cut down somewhere in the confusion of retreat, his body afterwards stripped and put on public display for the entire city to see a final brutal punctuation mark on everything that single wedding announcement at Reading had eventually set in motion 7 years earlier, in a room full of men who never once imagined it would end quite like this. I think about that chain of events often honestly whenever I find myself tempted to treat Edward and Elizabeth's love story as simply romantic. It was romantic in its own way, two people who truly chose each other against every practical expectation of their world, holding on to that choice for nearly 2 decades of marriage. It also quite directly contributed to years of civil war, the deaths of noblemen on both sides, and the collapse of one of the most important political alliances of Edward's entire reign. Personal choice and political consequence were never really separate things for a king. They were the exact same decision viewed from 2 very different angles, and Edward, whether he fully understood it standing in that room at Reading or not, had chosen both at once. And here's the part of this story that took even longer to fully play out, the part that makes this entire chain of events feel almost eerily complete when you finally reach the end of it. Edward ruled for years afterward reasonably successfully, and eventually died in 1483, leaving behind 2 young sons to inherit his throne, a boy prince who should have simply become the next King of England without any real controversy at all. And it was only then, after Edward himself was safely dead and unable to defend his own marriage in person, that a new claim suddenly surfaced. According to this story, Edward had supposedly entered into a prior marriage contract with a different woman entirely, years before he ever met Elizabeth. A secret engagement that would have made his marriage to Elizabeth invalid from the very beginning, and every child born from it, including the 2 boys now expected to inherit the crown, illegitimate. Does that timing strike you as suspicious yet, or should I keep going? Here's what should immediately catch your attention about that claim. Nobody had ever raised it before. Not in 1464, when the marriage was first revealed at Reading, and would have been the perfect moment to challenge its legality if anyone honestly believed it invalid. Not during Warwick's rebellion, when discrediting Elizabeth would have handed Warwick exactly the political weapon he desperately needed. Not at any point across 19 years of marriage, 2 crowned kings, and a great deal of court gossip that surely would have seized on a scandal that useful had anyone actually believed it at the time. The claim appeared only after Edward's death, at precisely the moment his own brother needed a legal justification to claim the throne for himself, instead of allowing Edward's sons to inherit it. Make of that timing whatever you will. Most historians looking at this today find it difficult to conclude anything other than that the story arrived exactly when it became politically useful, and not one moment sooner, dressed up in just enough legal formality to look convincing to anyone who wanted a reason to believe it. But convenient or not, it worked. Edward's marriage was formally declared invalid. His children were declared illegitimate, stripped of their claim to the crown, by a council eager to accept whatever justification let them move forward with a clean conscience. His own brother took the crown for himself, instead crowned in a ceremony that only months earlier nobody in England would have predicted or believed possible. And the two young boys, Edward's own sons, the ones this entire secret marriage had originally been fought so hard to protect and legitimize, were quietly moved into the Tower of London for their own safety, according to the official explanation offered at the time, and were never seen in public again. What actually happened to them afterward remains one of the most debated mysteries in the whole of English history, argued over by historians for more than 5 centuries now, without ever reaching a conclusion everyone can agree on. Sit with that ending for a moment because it deserves more than a quick passing mention. A single quiet wedding spoken almost silently at dawn, in a small room in Grafton, with barely 5 witnesses present and no public announcement at all, eventually rippled outward across nearly 2 decades through a humiliated kingmaker, a civil war, a queen giving birth inside a church while hiding from her own husband's enemies, and finally a legal technicality dredged up at precisely the right moment to erase 2 children from their own father's legacy entirely. Every single choice that couple made in that candlelit room back at the very beginning of tonight's story was in its own quiet way still unfolding decades later in ways neither of them could possibly have imagined standing there at dawn, hoping most likely for nothing more complicated than a quiet, private beginning to their life together. We've spent this entire evening exploring how little control most medieval people actually had over who they married, and how much money law and family expectation shaped even the most private decisions of their lives. Edward and Elizabeth stand out precisely because they broke every single one of those rules and chose each other anyway, defying advisors, foreign alliances, and centuries of royal tradition in a single quiet ceremony. And yet even their story, the one genuine exception we opened tonight with, still ended up consumed by exactly the same forces everyone else had to answer, to power timing and other people's ambitions closing in around a marriage that had once felt, if only for a single dawn, entirely and defiantly their own. It's a strange note to end their particular chapter on love as both the exception and eventually the very thing used against them. And it leaves us with an equally strange question to close out tonight's whole journey with. After everything we've walked through together, the banns and the bloodlines, the dowries and the doorways, the stockings thrown across candlelit bedrooms, and the courts that argued over what happened inside them, how much of any of it actually survived into the world we live in now? How much of what feels timeless about a modern wedding is really just an old habit? Nobody ever questioned closely enough to notice where it came from. Let's actually answer that question properly, because once you start looking for the leftover pieces of everything we've covered tonight, you start noticing them absolutely everywhere, in a modern wedding hiding in plain sight, disguised as simple tradition. Nobody thinks to question anymore. Think about the last wedding you attended, or the one you're planning yourself, or even just the one you've pictured in your head at some point. How many small moments in that day actually trace back quietly to something we've spent the last several hours unpacking together tonight? That ring sliding onto a 4th finger during modern vows. We already walked through exactly where that comes from a handful of medieval scholars, convinced wrongly but sincerely that a vein ran straight from that particular finger to the heart, a belief solid enough to be written directly into medieval wedding law. Nobody believes that anymore, not for a moment, and any doctor could correct the misunderstanding in seconds. And yet the finger itself never changed. Millions of couples still slide a ring onto that exact spot every single year, carrying forward a piece of outdated medieval anatomy nobody bothered to update once the tradition had already settled into place, long after the reasoning behind it quietly crumbled. Somewhere in a modern bridal shop, a shade of blue ribbon or a blue garter still gets tucked into a wedding outfit for luck. The last quiet trace of an old belief tying that particular colour to purity, and to the Virgin Mary worn now by brides who'd mostly tell you they have no idea why blue specifically feels like the traditional choice, only that it does, and always has for as long as anyone in the family can remember. It simply does the way plenty of inherited habits simply do, long after the original reasoning behind them has quietly faded from memory into pure unexamined custom. The garter toss itself, that slightly chaotic little ritual, some modern receptions still include traces its own tangled history straight back to guests, grabbing at a medieval bride's clothing for luck, until brides finally got tired of it and started throwing the garter to the crowd themselves rather than have it torn away from them piece by over-enthusiastic wedding guests. What was once a genuine scramble for luck has softened over centuries into a light-hearted photo opportunity, a groom kneeling to slide a strip of lace off his new wife's leg while everyone laughs and cheers, but the bones of the custom, the crowd, the clothing, the shared laughter, are still recognizably the same underneath all that softening. Even that quiet formal moment in a modern ceremony, when an officiant asks whether anyone present objects to the marriage, is a direct descendant of the medieval bans we spent time with earlier tonight, when a couple's intention to marry had to survive 3 public announcements before anyone would consider the marriage legitimate. Almost nobody actually raises an objection at a modern wedding, of course. The moment has become pure ceremony, a formality everyone expects will pass in silence, sometimes even played for a nervous laugh among the guests. But centuries ago, that exact question carried real legal teeth capable of stopping a wedding in its tracks, if the wrong person happened to be standing in the crowd with a secret worth speaking up about. And even the champagne toast that follows a modern wedding speech carries a faint echo of something we spent real time on tonight, that rowdy beer-soaked tradition of the bride ale, where the whole point of the gathering was quite literally drinking together in the couple's honour. The scale has shrunk considerably, and nobody's selling homemade beer out of a courtyard to fund their new household anymore, but the basic instinct raising a glass together to mark the occasion never actually went away. It just got quieter and considerably more expensive per bottle. Here's one more, though, that I've been saving because I think it might be my favourite discovery from this entire journey we've taken together tonight. Think about the word honeymoon for a second. Most people today hear it and picture a romantic getaway, a beach somewhere, a couple slipping away together right after their wedding to enjoy a little uninterrupted time as newlyweds. That meaning is real, but it's actually a fairly recent addition, only really settling into common use around the early 1800s. The word itself is much older than that, and its original meaning is stranger, and honestly a little more bittersweet than the version we use today. One popular explanation traces it back to an old custom, sometimes credited to early medieval and Norse tradition, of gifting a newly married couple enough honey-based mead to last through roughly a full cycle of the moon, about a month, meant to encourage fertility and a sweet start to married life together. The honey standing in for sweetness, and the moon marking out the time frame. It's a lovely image, and it's the version most people repeat without a second thought, passed down through wedding blogs and toast speeches as settled fact. But the earliest confirmed written use of the actual word from an English text in the 1500s tells a rather different story. It describes the honeymoon not as a joyful getaway at all, but as a brief fleeting period of tenderness at the very start of a marriage, one that, like the moon itself, was expected to wane, the sweetness fading gradually the same way a full moon slowly shrinks back down toward darkness. The comparison wasn't meant kindly. It was a warning dressed up as a compliment. an early acknowledgement that the sweetest part of any relationship tends to fade a little once the everyday reality of married life properly sets in dishes, arguments and all. Would you have guessed that one of the most romantic words in the modern wedding vocabulary actually started out as a slightly cynical joke about how quickly newlywed bliss tends to fade? I love that detail because it captures something true about almost everything we've explored together tonight. The traditions survive. The meanings underneath them quietly shift, get softened, get reinterpreted by each new generation, until the original, sometimes far stranger, reasoning behind them disappears, completely replaced by whatever story feels nicer to tell at a modern reception. But if I'm honest with you, the small surviving customs were never really the most important thing we uncovered tonight. The real shift, the one that actually separates a medieval wedding from a modern one, has almost nothing to do with rings, colours or toasts at all. It has nothing to do with fabric or feasts or which finger a ring happens to sit on. It's the reason people get married in the first place. We spent this entire evening walking through negotiations, dowries, forbidden bloodlines, bans and legal battles, over consummation, and underneath nearly every single one of those stories sat the same quiet assumption. Marriage for most medieval people wasn't primarily about romantic love. It was about survival alliance, land security and family strategy. Love treated at best as a hoped-for bonus that might, if you were fortunate, grow slowly over time after the paperwork had already been settled. The idea that two ordinary people should choose each other purely because they loved one another with money and family status, treated as secondary concerns rather than the entire point of the exercise, wasn't the medieval norm at all. Historians who study the shift generally place the widespread rise of that particular expectation, centuries later, gathering real momentum only around the 17 and 1800s, as certain cultural and philosophical shifts across Europe slowly began placing individual feeling above family duty in ways medieval society would have found almost impossible to comprehend. That's a properly strange thing to sit with if you let it settle in fully. The single expectation most modern couples treat as the entire point of getting married at all, choosing someone purely because you love them, is historically speaking one of the newer ideas in this whole story, younger by far than the rings, the veils and the vows we've spent all night tracing back through the centuries, which brings us back one final time tonight to where this whole story actually began. That quiet dawn wedding in Grafton wasn't simply a charming love story we open with for atmosphere. It was in its own small way, centuries ahead of its time, a preview of an entirely different way of thinking about marriage that most of the world hadn't caught up to yet and wouldn't fully embrace for generations afterward. Edward chose Elizabeth for reasons that had nothing to do with land alliance or family strategy, and the rarity of that choice is exactly why it caused such an uproar in the first place. It wasn't simply scandalous because Elizabeth was a commoner. It was scandalous because Edward had dared to treat his own feelings as reason enough in a world that had spent centuries building an entire legal, financial and religious system specifically designed to make sure nobody else got to do the same thing. Think about that for a second. A king of all people, the person with the least practical need to marry for love since his marriage, carried more political weight than almost anyone else's in the entire kingdom, was the one who quietly decided to do it anyway. And the consequences, as we spent the last stretch of tonight discovering, followed him for the rest of his reign, and beyond it rippling into his own children's fate long after he was gone. Choosing love in that world was never really free. It simply happened to be a price Edward, for whatever mixture of romance and stubbornness drove him, was apparently willing to pay. That's really the thread running underneath everything we've covered together tonight if you look closely enough. Most of the people in these stories, Marjorie risking her entire family for a bailiff, Her mother despised a queen forging a dead pope's signature just to marry the man she'd chosen for herself. An ordinary bride brewing her own beer to fund a household. Nobody was giving her for free. A widow fighting simply to collect the dower. The law had already promised her, were all quietly pushing back in whatever small way was available to them, against a world that rarely asked what they actually wanted. Some of them won, plenty of them didn't. But the wanting itself, that stubborn, very human insistence on choosing for yourself, even when the entire system was built to stop you, feels remarkably familiar, even after all these centuries, close enough that it doesn't feel like ancient history at all, once you sit with it properly. It feels more than anything like people doing exactly what people have always done, quietly hoping for a little more say over their own lives than the world around them was willing to grant. So here's what I'll leave you with tonight before we finally let this story rest. The next time you find yourself at a wedding watching a ring slide onto a fourth finger, or catching a glimpse of something blue tucked into a bride's outfit, or raising a glass for a toast, you'll know you're not simply watching tradition for tradition's sake. You're watching the last quiet fingerprints of 1,000 years of arguments over money, blood, faith, and power softened now into something that mostly just looks like celebration. Somewhere underneath all that lace and flowers and champagne sits an entire history of people who rarely got a real say in their own marriages, and a much smaller, much braver handful who decided to take that say for themselves anyway, whatever it cost them. If any part of tonight's story stuck with you, I'd truly love to hear which one down in the comments whenever you happen to sit down and write it out. Was it Marjorie and her secret vow, Edward and his dawn wedding, or maybe that one particularly memorable line about cherries nobody could find? Tell me. I look through every single one, and I mean that as sincerely tonight as I did at the very start of this journey together. And if tonight's story kept you company through a long night, or helped you drift off somewhere along the way, a quiet tap on the like button or a subscribe for the next time you need something gentle to fall asleep, to truly helps this small corner of the internet keep these stories coming more than you probably realize. Thank you truly for spending this time with me tonight, no matter how much of it you managed to stay awake for. If you drifted off somewhere around the impotence trials, I promise I won't take it personally. That's exactly what these quiet hours together are for. Rest well tonight. Let the candles in your own mind burn down slowly the way they did in Grafton all those centuries ago. Let the noise of the day and even the noise of tonight's story gradually settle into something soft and far away. And when you're ready for another story, another quiet corner of the past waiting to be gently unpacked, I'll be right here with the lights low and the next chapter already waiting. Sleep well, friend. Thank you for tonight. I'll see you next time.